When we think of history, we picture neat timelines, dates and names, all lined up like stepping stones. But that's an illusion. The truth is, most of history is missing. Scrolls have burned to ash. Temples have crumbled into dust. Entire libraries have been wiped out by war, conquest, and even deliberate destruction. Whole civilizations rose and vanished without leaving more than a few fragments behind. Maybe a line carved into stone or a rumor in a dusty old chronicle. And between those fragments, silence. It's in that quiet place that the imagination stirs. What was written in the thousands of Maya books that were burned in the 16th century? Who built the ancient megaliths that stretch across South America? What secrets still sit on shelves today, locked in untranslated clay tablets from Mesopotamia? And it isn't just lost texts. Sometimes it's centuries of history, where the record almost goes dark, like the missing centuries after Rome's fall. Other times it's entire cultures swallowed by jungle or sand, erased so completely that even their names are unknown. These aren't obscure details. They're whole chapters of our shared story gone. This won't be a straight lecture or a neat timeline. Think of it instead as a journey, one where we pick up the fragments and look at them together. Some are small puzzles, like a single undeciphered inscription. Others are sweeping mysteries, like civilizations erased by conquest, disease, or time. So, wherever you are right now, sit back, relax, and feel free to let this play in the background. The visuals are here for context if you want them, but they're not necessary. You can just listen, follow along, and let the stories unfold. And to begin, we start not with an empire or a library, but with a few clay tablets unearthed in Romania. Strange marks cover their surface, older than Mesopotamia's first cities. Were these the world's first written words, or just meaningless symbols in clay? Let's jump in. In the summer of 1961, an archaeologist named Nikolai Vasa was overseeing excavations near the small village of Tartaria in Romania. What he found there would ignite decades of debate, speculation, and controversy. Among the usual finds of Neolithic pottery and figurines, workers unearthed 3 small clay tablets unlike anything else in Europe at the time. Alongside them were 2 clay figurines and the skeleton of a woman carefully buried. The tablets immediately stood out. One was round, the other 2 rectangular, and all were pressed with incised symbols, marks that looked intentional, organized, and even systematic. At first glance, they might not seem impressive. They're palm-sized crude compared to the polished tablets of Mesopotamia. But when scholars dated the surrounding material, the results suggested something extraordinary. The tablets appeared to be more than 7,000 years old, around 5,300 BC, which would make them older than the earliest Sumerian cuneiform by over a millennium. This discovery raised a startling possibility. For decades, the standard view of history placed Mesopotamia as the cradle of writing, with uniform tablets appearing around 3,200 BC. Yet here in the Balkans, much earlier examples of what looked suspiciously like writing had turned up. The Tartaria Tablets, as they became known, suddenly threatened to upend a timeline that many historians thought was settled. If they were authentic, and if they were genuinely that old, they could represent the earliest known attempt at a written script. The tablets themselves are simple in form. The round one contains a cross-like motif and groups of lines, while the rectangular ones have rows of symbols, chevrons, dots, zigzags, even something that looks like a stylized tree or person. There are only about 13 distinct signs among them. But what matters is the order and repetition. They don't look like random doodles. They appear organized, as if conveying a sequence of information. Interpretations have varied wildly over the years. Some researchers argue that these marks are praetoriting, not a full language system, but a symbolic code used for record-keeping, perhaps to track trade, livestock, or ritual offerings. Others counter that they are ritual objects, their symbols meaningful only in a religious or ceremonial sense, not in the practical way writing later developed. And there's another idea that they are connected to the Vinca culture, a Neolithic society that stretched across the Balkans during this time. Thousands of Vinca artifacts, pottery, figurines, tools are marked with similar abstract signs. Scholars still debate whether those signs were decorative, symbolic, or the beginnings of a script. The association with Vinca is one of the strongest arguments in favor of the tablets being authentic cultural products rather than imports. But there are complications. For one, the skeleton found buried with the tablets complicates the context. The woman, possibly a shaman or ritual specialist, had the tablets and figurines placed with her in death. That could suggest they were sacred objects, talismans, or tokens of her role rather than texts to be read. If that's the case, their meaning may have been entirely spiritual, never intended as practical writing. Then there's the carbon dating problem. When the tablets were first analyzed, the organic material from the burial context was dated to around 5300 BC. But some skeptics argue the tablets themselves might be younger because they were fired at low temperatures. They're fragile and the chance of contamination in testing is high. Some have suggested they could date closer to 3000 BC, which would still make them very old, but not dramatically earlier than Mesopotamian cuneiform. Others even claimed they might not belong to the original burial at all, but were introduced later and accidentally associated with the older context. Adding to the mystery is the possibility of foreign influence. Some have pointed out similarities between a few of the Tartaria symbols and early Near Eastern signs. Could these tablets have been imports? Objects carried west from Mesopotamia or Anatolia and deposited in a Balkan grave? If so, they wouldn't rewrite the history of writing, but they would still tell us something remarkable about long distance and contact in prehistory. The debate has never been fully settled, partly because the tablets are unique. No other exact parallels have been found. Thousands of Vinca artifacts exist with similar signs, but nothing identical. Without a larger corpus, it's impossible to test whether these were truly systematic symbols or just local variations. To make matters worse, the tablets were baked after discovery. Vasa reportedly fired them in a kiln to preserve them, which destroyed any remaining chance of directly dating the clay itself. That act, intended to save them forever, limited the scientific tools we can use to analyze them. Still, the idea that these might represent the world's first writing is hard to ignore. If you put the Tartaria sign by side with later Sumerian or Egyptian symbols, the resemblance is striking. Some patterns look almost identical, though whether that's coincidence or connection is unclear. Imagine the implications. If writing developed first in Eastern Europe rather than Mesopotamia, our entire narrative of civilization's cradle would have to expand, perhaps even relocate. Of course, most mainstream scholars remain cautious. The consensus is that the tablets belong in the category of prototyping or symbolic notation, not true script. Without a larger body of text, it's impossible to demonstrate grammar, syntax, or even vocabulary. At best, they are tantalizing hints that Neolithic cultures were experimenting with ways to record meaning long before cuneiform standardized it. And yet, the mystery lingers. Why were they buried with a skeleton? What was their role in that person's life? Why are there no other close parallels across Europe? And why, out of all the artifacts we found, do these 3 tiny tablets still inspire such debate more than 60 years later? The Tartaria tablets are a perfect example of how fragile history can be. 3 small pieces of clay, fragile and cracked, hold questions that entire libraries can't answer. They might be evidence of the very first steps toward writing, or they might be ritual tokens whose meaning was never meant to outlive their culture. They could rewrite history, or they could remain an intriguing dead end. So if the world's first writing is here in Romania, not Mesopotamia, what does that do to our timeline? Or maybe these weren't words at all, just ritual markings that never led anywhere. The mystery is we'll never know which. From mysterious markings pressed into clay in prehistoric Romania, we jump forward several millennia to a very different kind of mystery, not scratched into tablets, but written into the Gospels themselves. The Bible skips nearly 2 decades of Jesus' life. At 12 years old, he is described in Jerusalem debating with temple priests and astonishing them with his questions. Then the story goes dark. Nearly 18 years later, he reappears at the Jordan River, baptized by John, ready to begin his ministry. For someone whose every word would later be recorded, copied, and debated across continents, this missing stretch of time has always been one of the most intriguing gaps in history. The Gospels give us only the briefest glimpse of his early years. His birth and infancy are covered by the Nativity, stories with Matthew and Luke providing slightly different accounts. Luke includes the famous story of Jesus at 12, where his parents lose track of him during a pilgrimage and find him in the temple holding his own in theological debate. After that, the narrative falls silent until he emerges as an adult. No teenage years, no apprenticeship, no anecdotes from his 20s. The most straightforward explanation is that he stayed in Nazareth, living quietly and working as a tekton, a craftsman. The word is often translated as carpenter, but it really refers to a builder, someone who could have worked with stone, wood, or both. In a growing region like Galilee, there would have been steady work constructing houses, repairing tools, and building infrastructure. From this perspective, there was nothing unusual to record. He lived like his neighbors, supporting his family, learning the rhythms of local life. In other words, the lost years may not have been dramatic at all. They were simply ordinary. But lack of information invites speculation. Across centuries, traditions developed that suggested Jesus traveled far beyond Galilee. Egypt is the earliest and perhaps most plausible. The Gospel of Matthew already places the Holy Family there as refugees when Jesus was an infant, fleeing Herod's persecution. Some writers imagined he stayed longer, learning from Jewish communities in Alexandria or exposed to Egyptian philosophy. From there, the stories grow more ambitious. In India, legends tell of a sage named Essa, who preached compassion and gathered disciples. In Kashmir, a local tradition claims Jesus not only visited but died and was buried there. In Britain, a popular legend repeated in medieval and later writings suggests Jesus travelled with Joseph of Arimathea, walking the hills of Glastonbury. These tales are impossible to prove, but they became part of the folklore that fills the gap. Written sources outside the New Testament do little to help. A handful of apocryphal Gospels attempt to expand on Jesus' childhood or youth, but most date from much later and include highly imaginative embellishments. They describe miraculous feats and unusual encounters more like theological parables than historical accounts. In the 19th century, a Russian adventurer named Nicholas Notovich claimed he discovered a Tibetan manuscript describing the life of Isa, in which Jesus spent years in India before returning west. The story made headlines, but scholars who investigated found no evidence of such a manuscript, and most dismissed his claim as fabricated. Still, it demonstrates how eager people have always been to explain those silent years. Even the earliest Christian writers had little to say. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, speculated on Jesus' youth but offered no details. Irenaeus mentioned his maturity but skipped over the missing decades. The Church itself eventually came to regard the silence as deliberate. The canonical Gospels, selected and preserved by the early Church, focus on the ministry, the teaching, the miracles, the passion, death, and resurrection. The years before are passed over either because they were unremarkable or because they were not considered theologically important. In this view, what mattered was not the boy or young man, but the teacher and Savior revealed in his ministry. And yet, the mystery itself remains striking. For a man who later drew crowds and reshaped religious thought across empires, nearly 20 years of complete obscurity is unusual. Was he quietly working in Nazareth, preparing in ways too subtle to record? Or was he traveling further afield, learning from traditions beyond Judea, traces of which were later remembered in legends from Egypt, India, or even the far edges of the Roman world? If you imagine a map of the ancient world, You can trace these possibilities like spokes from a wheel, Nazareth at the center, lines stretching south to Egypt, east to Mesopotamia and India, north into Asia Minor, and west into Europe. Along these routes, stories and cultures mixed freely. Traders carried ideas as easily as goods. It's not impossible that a young Jewish craftsman could have joined caravans, followed roads, or simply sought new experiences. The question is whether he did. And if he did, why none of the Gospels chose to preserve it. Mainstream scholars are cautious. Most agree the evidence for distant travel is too thin to support. The apocryphal texts and later legends are fascinating but not reliable. From their perspective, the most likely scenario remains the simplest. Jesus stayed in Galilee until he began his ministry, and the lack of information is simply a reflection of the Gospel writers' priorities. They wanted to tell the story of his message and mission, not his adolescence or early adulthood. So why did the Gospel writers leave these years unwritten? And where was he during that time? That's a question without a final answer. One that will always linger between the lines of Scripture. After looking at the gaps in the life of a single man, Jesus, it's worth widening the lens to see how entire centuries can vanish from the record. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, Europe entered a period where the written record grows thin. Historians still debate whether the term Dark Ages is fair. But what cannot be denied is that between the 5th and 10th centuries, the amount of surviving material shrinks dramatically. Compared to Rome's habit of writing everything down, decrees, taxes, laws, speeches, the following centuries look fragmentary. Whole decades pass with barely a word from contemporary witnesses. Rome had been a civilization of scribes and administrators. Its provincial governors filed reports. Military campaigns were chronicled, and historians like Tacitus or Livy produced dense narratives. With Rome's fall, this infrastructure broke apart. New rulers came to power: the Visigoths in Spain, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Franks in Gaul, the Lombards in northern Italy. They governed differently. Some wrote laws such as the Visigothic Code, but none continued the Roman tradition of detailed annual histories. Literacy narrowed, often confined to monasteries and clerics, and even they recorded events sporadically. The result is a patchwork. A few annals exist, like the Chronicle of Fredegar in the 7th century, or the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle compiled later, but they are selective. In Ireland, monks kept records, but many entries for the early centuries were written retrospectively based on memory or oral tradition. That makes them valuable but not always reliable. For many regions, we rely on archaeology to fill the silence. Anglo-Saxon England, for example, is understood through cemeteries. Jewelry, coins, and monumental finds like the Sutton who ship burial rather than contemporary written accounts. One of the most striking mysteries from this period is the so-called Dust Veil event of 536 AD. Writers in Byzantium describe the sun as dim and pale, giving no warmth. Irish records note famine. Tree ring studies reveal years of poor growth worldwide. Today, scientists suspect a massive volcanic eruption, perhaps in Iceland or Central America, that sent ash into the atmosphere. The eruption may have triggered crop failures, famines, and even waves of disease, including the plague of Justinian that followed. Yet, the records are so limited we cannot be sure. Imagine an event with global impact today, yet described in only a handful of lines. The migrations of entire peoples are another area where the record is frustratingly thin. We know that Slavic groups spread across Eastern Europe, reshaping the region's demographics. Avars and Bulgars pressed into the Balkans, leaving their imprint on future nations. But what we lack are contemporary descriptions of how this happened, what conflicts took place, and how the old populations adapted. Much of what we know comes from archaeology, changes in pottery styles, burial customs, or settlement patterns. Written accounts are vague and often centuries after the fact. In this environment of scarcity, archaeology becomes the primary storyteller. The Sutton whose ship burial in England, discovered in 1939, gave a glimpse into the wealth and sophistication of early Anglo-Saxon elites. helmets, shields, Byzantine silverware, yet no chronicle tells us who was buried there. In Norway, the Gstad and Osberg ships revealed the grandeur of Viking burials, filling in gaps where text is mute. Coins with the names of kings otherwise lost extend our knowledge of rulers and economies. Scientific methods like tree ring dating and ice core samples help reconstruct climate patterns, often telling us more about famine years than surviving manuscripts. Because the gaps are so broad, they invite speculation. In the 1990s, a German writer proposed the phantom time hypothesis, the idea that about 300 years of medieval history were invented, meaning figures like Charlemagne never existed. Mainstream historians dismiss it easily. The archaeology and independent dating methods prove those centuries were real, but the theory found an audience, showing how unsettling the absence of records can feel. When a bookshelf suddenly has missing volumes, people wonder if those years were ever real at all. That's not to say nothing was happening. The so-called Dark Ages saw Christianity spread deeper into Europe. Missionaries traveled to convert new peoples and monasteries preserve classical works. The foundations of modern European states were being laid. The Carolingians, Lombards, and Anglo-Saxons were shaping territories that would define the Middle Ages. Yet, because so little was written, only major figures stand out clearly. Charlemagne is remembered partly because more documents survive about him, making him a bright point in an otherwise dimly lit landscape. It's helpful to picture the record visually. Roman history is like a long scroll, dense with detail. After 476, that scroll becomes thinner with torn sections and missing chapters. In place of text, we substitute material evidence, coins, broken pottery, ship burials, even traces of volcanic ash and ice cores. These speak volumes, but they do not tell stories the way Livia or Tacitus once did. The lingering question is whether these centuries were truly a collapse of civilization or simply a collapse in record-keeping. People continued to rule, trade, farm, and worship. Cities shrank but did not vanish. Technologies changed slowly, but life carried on. What was missing was the habit of writing it all down. For historians, that absence makes these centuries one of the hardest to reconstruct. So, was Europe truly living through an age of decline? Or do we simply lack the paper trail to see its complexity? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. These centuries remind us how fragile history can be, how easily records can vanish, and how much of the past can be reduced to guesswork. And from this gap in Europe's record, we move to a very different kind of archive, one that survived in physical form. We now step back thousands of years into prehistory to a time before writing, before kings, and before cities as we usually define them. On the plains of modern-day Ukraine and Moldova, archaeologists have uncovered the traces of settlements so large and organized that they force us to rethink where urban life began. These are the Kucheni Trapilia megasites, some of the largest prehistoric settlements in Europe, flourishing between 5000 and 3000 BC. If you could fly over them today with modern LiDAR imaging, the scale would be clear. Beneath farmland and rolling hills lie the outlines of settlements arranged in giant concentric circles. Houses stood shoulder to shoulder, sometimes 2 stories high, built from timber frames packed with clay. In the center, wide plazas and communal areas gave shape to daily life. Some sites stretched across several square kilometers, housing populations estimated at 15,000 to 20,000, and in the largest cases possibly up to 40,000. That's larger than most Mesopotamian cities of the time and over 1,000 years earlier. The story of their discovery began in the 19th century. In 1884, Czech archaeologist Vikenty Kvoa uncovered the first traces near Kiev. At first, scholars assumed these were scattered villages. Only later, with systematic excavations and aerial surveys, did it become clear that they represented something far larger, what some call Europe's first cities. The term megaite wasn't used until the late 20th century, when the true size and density of these settlements became undeniable. What made these sites remarkable wasn't just their size, but their sophistication. Houses were standardized, suggesting shared planning. Each had ovens, storage areas, and hearths, indicating a domestic life that was comfortable and consistent across the settlement. There is evidence of weaving looms, hinting at textile production, and pottery workshops turning out distinctive ceramics decorated with spirals, zigzags, and stylized animal motifs. Their pottery is some of the most striking in prehistoric Europe, with red, black, and white patterns that seem almost modern in design. Small clay figurines are among the most intriguing finds. Many are female with exaggerated features suggesting fertility symbols or religious icons. Others depict animals perhaps tied to rituals or myths now lost to us. Archaeologists debate whether these figurines were toys, ritual objects, or representations of deities. Whatever their purpose, they show that the Cucuteni Tripilia culture had a symbolic and artistic life as rich as their material one. Agriculture supported these vast communities. Archaeological evidence points to large-scale cereal cultivation with wheat and barley as staples. Storage jars found in houses suggest food surpluses that could sustain large populations. Hearing of cattle, sheep, and pigs supplemented the diet, and hunting and fishing remained part of daily life. For settlements numbering in the tens of thousands, careful management of land and resources must have been essential, and yet for all their achievement, the settlements disappeared around 3000 BC. The end of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture remains one of prehistory's enduring mysteries. Many of their houses were deliberately burned, sometimes entire settlements at once. Layers of ash are common in excavations, suggesting these weren't isolated accidents. Why torch your own homes? Some scholars suggest ritualized destruction, a cultural practice of renewal where communities periodically rebuilt from scratch. Others point to resource stress. Farming at this scale may have exhausted the soil, forcing communities to move and abandon their sites. Climate change is another possibility, with shifting conditions making their intensive agriculture unsustainable. There's also the puzzle of why these settlements never developed into permanent stone cities like those in Mesopotamia. Despite their scale, they remained built from timber and clay, leaving little that could endure. Without writing, their social and political systems remained speculative. Were they governed by chiefs, councils, or communal decision-making? No palaces or monumental temples have been found, suggesting power may have been more distributed. This absence of central authority makes their coordination even more impressive. How did tens of thousands of people build and live together without kings, armies, or written laws? The surprises don't end there. Some houses appear to have been 2 stories tall, an architectural feat in Neolithic Europe. Certain megasites were so vast that if they truly held 40,000 people, they would have been larger than contemporary cities in Sumer or Egypt. Imagine lining up populations. Uruk in Mesopotamia around 3500 BC had perhaps 20,000 residents. The Trailioites, 1,000 years earlier, may have been twice that size. Yet because they left no written record, they sit outside the standard story of first civilizations. Archaeology fills in the gaps. Post holes reveal the outlines of houses. Soil analysis shows fields where crops once grew. Decorative motifs link sites across hundreds of kilometers, proving a shared cultural identity. But there are still debates. Some scholars argue that the population estimates are exaggerated, suggesting these sites may not have been fully inhabited year-round. Instead, they might have been seasonal gathering places, swelling in size during festivals or communal events. If so, they would still represent an extraordinary level of coordination across wide territories. Other questions remain about their connections with neighbors. Were they trading with cultures to the south in the Balkans or Anatolia? Their pottery style spread widely, and their metallurgical skills suggest some contact with emerging copper-working communities. The Cucuteni Tripilia people lived at the cusp of Europe's shift from stone to metal, and their artifacts show an awareness of that transition. The mystery of their disappearance only deepens the intrigue. By 3000 BC, the settlements were abandoned. Some believe they were displaced by migrating steppe cultures from the east, ancestors of the Indo-Europeans. Others argue internal decline did them in. Whatever the cause, their vast settlements fell quiet, and Europe would not see urban life on that scale again for millennia. Today, the Cucuteni Triilia culture challenges our understanding of how and where complex societies began. For decades, the narrative placed Mesopotamia and Egypt as the unquestioned firsts. Yet here in Eastern Europe, long before the pyramids, tens of thousands of people were building proto-cities, crafting intricate art, and organizing themselves in ways we're only beginning to understand. It's worth visualizing the comparison. Imagine a timeline graphic in Mesopotamia. Cities like Uruk begin to grow around 3500 BC. In Egypt, the first pharaohs unify the Nile around 300 BC. But 1,000 years earlier in the fields of Ukraine and Moldova, Cucuteni Triilia megasites already housed populations as large or larger. If these settlements had persisted, our story of the world's first civilizations might center not on the Fertile Crescent, but on the plains of Eastern Europe. And that's what makes their end so puzzling. Why abandon something so advanced? Was it environmental collapse, soil exhaustion, or shifting climate? Was it external pressure from migrating peoples? Or was it part of a cultural cycle of destruction and renewal that we simply don't understand? The archaeological record suggests many possibilities, but no definitive answer. So, we're left with the image of great concentric settlements filled with clay houses and decorated pottery rising on the plains 5,000 years ago, only to vanish before history had a chance to write them down. Europe's first cities disappeared before cities were even supposed to exist. Leaving behind the vast proto-cities of Eastern Europe, we move south to the banks of the Nile, where another puzzle in early history awaits us. Egypt is often thought of as beginning with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 300 BC, when Nar, sometimes called Menes, is credited with donning the double crown and becoming the first pharaoh. But the centuries before that are murkier. Archaeology reveals cultures flourishing along the river valley, building wealth, creating art, and experimenting with symbols that look suspiciously like the beginnings of writing. Yet, in the official timeline, they almost vanish, overshadowed by the rise of the dynastic kings. Before Nar, several distinct phases of Egyptian prehistory have been identified. The Badarian culture, dating to around 4,400 to 4000 BC, is considered the earliest agricultural society in Upper Egypt. They cultivated grain, herded cattle, and produced simple but elegant pottery. Black-topped redware that remains one of their signatures. Their burials, though modest, show careful preparation with bodies oriented toward the west and accompanied by grave goods. This tells us they already had ideas about death in the afterlife long before pyramids ever dominated the horizon. Following them came the Nata culture, divided into three phases. Nata 1, 2, and 3 spanning roughly 4000 to 300 BC. Over these centuries, things accelerate dramatically. Pottery becomes more elaborate, decorated with boats, animals, and geometric. Motifs dot stone palettes appear, often in the shape of animals, which later evolve into ceremonial palettes like the famous Nar palette. Elite burials grow more complex with larger tombs and richer offerings. By the Nata II phase, trade networks stretched beyond Egypt, with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and cedar from Lebanon making their way into the Nile Valley. And then suddenly around 3100 BC, we see the leap. Writing appears, monumental tombs are built at Abydos, and kingship emerges seemingly fully formed. It's as if scattered farming communities transformed almost overnight into one of the world's first centralized states. How did this happen? What bridged the gap between modest village burials and the massive tombs of Egypt's first rulers? Some clues come from artifacts. At Abydos, in a burial known as Tomb Uj, Archaeologists uncovered a wealth of grave goods belonging to a ruler who lived around 3200 BC before Nar. Among them were small ivory tags with incised symbols that look like early hieroglyphs. These may be the earliest written records in Egypt used to label jars of wine or oil. If so, it means that kingship and writing existed before the so-called first pharaoh. Tomb UJ suggests the existence of a local king at Abydos centuries earlier than official history allows. Later king lists written under the pharaohs of the New Kingdom also complicate the story. They name a series of rulers predating Nar, sometimes called the dynasty Zero Kings. Figures like Scorpion I and Scorpion II appear in inscriptions wielding power and even commissioning monumental works. The famous scorpion mace head shows one such ruler wearing a crown, presiding over irrigation or ritual scenes. Were these shadowy figures Egypt's first kings later erased or folded into a simplified origin story? What makes this so intriguing is the suddenness of the transition. Chiefs don't usually transform into unified states overnight. It suggests there must have been intermediate steps. Rulers experimenting with authority, scribes developing symbols, artisans building ever more elaborate tombs that haven't survived in the record. Did floods destroy settlements? Were early rulers deliberately omitted from official lists to make later kings appear as founders? We don't know, but the gap is striking. There are other tantalizing details. Pottery from Nata. 2 shows boats with multiple cabins, suggesting long-distance river transport was already. Sophisticated rock carvings from the eastern desert depict warriors with standards hinting at organized conflict before unification. Some scholars argue that early warfare between Upper and Lower Egypt during the Nata III period paved the way for consolidation under Nar. If true, then the neat story of unification hides a much bloodier and more complex process. Archaeology has filled in pieces of the puzzle, but gaps remain. Whole settlements from this period may lie undiscovered beneath later construction or lost to the Nile's shifting course. Organic materials decay quickly. So much of the evidence is gone. What we are left with are fragments, shards of pottery, a few inscriptions, scattered tombs. Yet from these we glimpse a society on the cusp of something extraordinary. The speed of development is especially remarkable when compared to Mesopotamia. In Sumer, the rise of cities and writing was gradual, evolving over centuries. In Egypt, the leap appears compressed, as if centuries of development were telescoped into a few generations. Was this due to unique geography with the Nile providing stability and surplus food? Or was it the result of influences from neighbors, ideas traveling in from Mesopotamia or the Levant? Debate continues. The unanswered questions extend to religion as well. The Badarian and Nata burials show consistent concern with the afterlife. But by the time of the first dynasties, the Egyptians had already developed elaborate concepts of gods, kingship, and the journey after death. How did that theology evolve? Did proto-priests of the pre-dynastic era create myths that were later codified under the pharaohs? Once again, we can only speculate. Even the crowns themselves are a mystery. Nar is depicted wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt and the white crown of Upper Egypt, symbolizing unification. But these crowns already existed in pre-dynastic iconography. Who first wore them? Were they symbolic headdresses used by local rulers long before Nar claimed them as his own? The symbols suggest continuity, but the individuals behind them remain unknown. It's possible that Egyptian civilization was not born in 3100 BC, but rather reorganized. Later, pharaohs may have rewritten history, streamlining the story for propaganda, casting Nar as the unifier to legitimize their own authority. If so, then the real first kings of Egypt have been lost. Their names buried in fragmentary inscriptions, their tombs unrecognized, their achievements folded into someone else's legacy. This gap in Egypt's prehistory is a reminder of how fragile our reconstructions are. We talk confidently of the first pharaoh, but every artifact suggests layers of forgotten rulers, cultures, and experiments in statehood that came before. Egypt's greatness didn't appear in a vacuum. It was built on centuries of development we barely understand. So if Na wasn't truly the first king, then who was? Was it the ruler buried in Tomb Uj who may have used the first hieroglyphs? Was it one of the scorpion kings whose names echo faintly in ceremonial objects? Or was it someone we haven't found yet, their tombs still hidden beneath the sands? And that leads us to the cliffhanger. Was Egyptian civilization really born in 3100 BC? Or are we missing the story of rulers erased before history began? That question lingers as we leave the Nile Valley's shadows and turn to another part of the world, where a single carved stone slab may hold the earliest writing system in the Americas. And yet, like Egypt's first kings, its language remains unread. Leaving behind the mysterious early kings of Egypt, we now move across the world to Mesoamerica, where another puzzle comes not from missing rulers, but from a single carved stone. In the Mexican state of Veracruz, a greenish slab of serpentine was pulled from the earth in the late 1990s. At first, it didn't seem remarkable. Road builders unearthed it while clearing earth for a construction project in 1999, but years later, when archaeologists examined it closely, they realized it carried markings unlike anything seen before. In 2006, it was formally recognized and named the Cascadile Block, after the village near where it was found. The slab is modest in size, about 36 centimeters long, 21 wide, and weighing just over 11 kilo. But carved into its surface are 62 distinct symbols. Some appear familiar, shapes that resemble maize kernels, insects, even thrones. Others are more abstract with loops, ovals, and cross-hatching. What makes it so intriguing is the arrangement. The symbols are lined up in horizontal rows, something that strongly suggests intentional sequencing, perhaps even the earliest form of writing in the Americas. If true, that would be extraordinary. For decades, scholars credited the Maya with developing the first true writing system in the Americas, with their elaborate hieroglyphs dating to around 300 to 400 BC. The Zapoch script from Monte Alban, also early, appears around the same time, but the Cascadia block is much older. Radiocarbon dating of associated materials places it at roughly 900 BC, right in the heart of the Mech civilization. That makes it at least 500 years older than the earliest Maya texts. The Mech, often described as the mother culture of Mesoamerica, flourished between 1500 and 400 BC. They are best known for their colossal stone heads, weighing several tons each with individualized features that may depict rulers. They built ceremonial centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta, where pyramids, plazas, and carved monuments suggest complex political and religious systems. But frustratingly, they left behind almost no clear written records until perhaps now. The Cascade block, if genuine writing, would push back the timeline of literacy in the New World by centuries. Imagine seeing the beginnings of an entire linguistic tradition carved into stone, then realizing that nothing else survives. No second example of this script has ever been found. No inscriptions on monuments, no painted codices, no carved stelae in the same style. It is a singular artifact, a lone witness to a lost system. Looking at the block, researchers note repeating signs. One symbol, resembling an insect, appears multiple times, as do maze motifs. The sequencing, the repetition, and the standardized size of the symbols all support the idea that this was more than decoration. It looks like language. Perhaps labels, a ritual text, or a record of offerings. Yet without a larger corpus, there is no way to decipher it. And this is where the debates begin. Some scholars accept the block as authentic evidence of Mech writing, while others urge caution. The context of its discovery is a problem. Because it was unearthed by road builders rather than in a controlled excavation, its exact archaeological setting is unclear. It was found with debris dated to the Mech period, but skeptics argue that without a clear site association, the dating may be less certain. Others suggest it could be an isolated ritual object, never meant as a full writing system. Still, the evidence for authenticity is compelling. The slab's material serpentine was commonly used by the Mech. The motifs resemble other Mech art, particularly depictions on pottery and figurines, and the sequencing in rows is hard to explain as anything other than a deliberate attempt at recording information. If it were decoration alone, why such systematic order? What makes the mystery sharper is that no later Mesoamerican scripts, Maya, Zapata, Epial, or Mixtec, directly resemble the cascadal symbols. It's possible that the Mech experimented with writing, but abandoned it, or that their script evolved into a form we no longer recognize. It's also possible that entire libraries of perishable material, bark paper codices or painted textiles once existed, but were lost in the humid environment long before the Spanish arrived. Consider how much has been erased. We know the Maya had thousands of books, yet only 4 survive today. If the Mech ever had such traditions, they would have been even more vulnerable to decay. The Cascile block may be the last survivor of an entire corpus of texts now vanished. One way to visualize it is to compare the block to a page from a Maya codex. The megaliths are intricate, dense, and clearly phonetic, representing syllables and words. The cascadial symbols are simpler, more abstract, but the idea is the same: ordered marks to record meaning. When placed side by side, they look like different stages of the same broader tradition. Was the block a prototype, the rough draft of literacy in the Americas, or was it a fully developed system that simply didn't spread? There are fascinating tidbits surrounding its study. Some researchers point out that the maize symbol is central, not surprising for a culture that revolved around corn as its staple crop and sacred element. The insect-like motif might represent transformation or fertility, common themes in Mesoamerican cosmology. Thrones suggest rulership. Put together, the block could record a political or religious event, perhaps a list of rulers or a set of ritual offerings. The controversy remains unresolved, partly because there is nothing else to compare it to. For decipherment, scholars need dozens or hundreds of examples, ideally with bilingual texts like the Rosetta Stone, with just one slab. The odds of cracking the code are slim. That leaves the Cascadia block as a tantalizing possibility. Maybe the first page of America's earliest book, or maybe a one-off ritual stone. Either way, it represents a gap as big as any in history. If this was writing, then somewhere in ancient Veracruz, there may once have been archives, painted scrolls, or carved monuments in the same script. They are gone now, lost to time, climate, or conquest. Theme, who carved heads that still tower today, may also have carved words, but their language has slipped beyond our reach. So the cliffhanger remains. If this was writing, then we're missing not just a stone slab, but the whole story of the Olme language. Where are the books, the records, the traditions that should have followed? Were they never made, or have they all been erased by history? And with that, we leave Veracruz and the puzzle of a single carved stone to move back east to the Assyrian city of Nineveh, where writing was not scarce, but abundant. Tens of thousands of clay tablets filling shelves in the world's first great library, much of which still waits to be understood. From the mystery of a single inscribed stone in Veracruz, we turn now to a place where words were anything but scarce. Long before Alexandria became famous for its great library, there was Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, and a king who set out to gather all the knowledge of the world. That king was Ashurbanipal, and the collection he built in the 7th century BC still stands as one of the most ambitious intellectual projects of the ancient world. His library, preserved in clay, may be the closest thing we have to the mind of Mesopotamia itself. Ashurbanipal ruled the Assyrian Empire from 668 to 627 BC, a period when Assyria was at its height. The empire stretched across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and into Egypt. Military campaigns kept its borders secure, but Ashurbanipal was not content to be remembered as just a conqueror. Unlike many rulers of his time, he was unusually proud of his literacy. In inscriptions, he boasted that he could read and write in both Adian, the language of his empire, and Sumerian, the far older tongue used in sacred and scholarly texts. It's a little like a modern leader claiming to be fluent in Latin and Greek. He wasn't just delegating learning to scribes. He wanted to be remembered as a scholar king. So he did something remarkable. Ashurbanipal began collecting texts. He ordered scribes across the empire to copy or bring back every kind of writing they could find. Myths, hymns, laws, omen texts, rituals, medical instructions, astronomical observations, dictionaries, even correspondence. The result was a collection of tens of thousands of clay tablets. Some scholars estimate that as many as 30,000 to 40,000 pieces once filled the library, making it one of the earliest large-scale attempts to assemble human knowledge in one place. Among these were treasures we still rely on today. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the great Mesopotamian poem about kingship, mortality, and the flood, was first rediscovered in Ashurbanipal's library. Without his collection, we might never have known it existed. Alongside Gilgamesh were myths about creation, lists of gods, and stories of heroes now forgotten. Astronomical texts charted the movements of planets and stars, vital for Mesopotamian astrology, but also useful for tracking time and seasons. Medical tablets describe treatments and prescriptions, part practical remedy, part ritual incantation. Legal codes and treaties recorded the workings of empire. Together they offer a window into nearly every aspect of Mesopotamian life. The tablets were written in puny form, the wedge-shaped script pressed into clay with a stylus. Many were in Ardean, but a significant number were in Samrian, already a dead language for more than 1,000 years by Ashurbanipal's time. This wasn't accidental. The king wanted to preserve the knowledge of the ancients, treating Sumerian as a scholarly language to be studied, much like Latin in medieval Europe. Some tablets were bilingual with the Sumerian text and an Akkadian translation side by side. For modern scholars, these have been invaluable, functioning as keys to deciphering and understanding lost scripts. Then the library was buried. In 612 BC, Nineveh fell to a coalition of Babylonians, Mes, and Scythians. The city was destroyed in fire and war, its palaces toppled. But the library's medium proved its salvation. While papyrus and parchment disintegrate in fire, clay tablets often survive. In fact, the blaze baked some of them harder, preserving them for over 2 millennia beneath the ruins of the city. The rediscovery came in the 19th century. In the 1850s, British archaeologist Austin Henry Leard and his teams excavated at Nineveh. When they unearthed rooms filled with broken clay fragments, they didn't initially realize the scale of what they had found. Shipments of tablets were sent back to the British Museum in London, where scholars began the painstaking work of reassembling and translating them. Among those working on the texts was George Smith, a banknot engraver turned Assyriologist, who in 1872 stunned the world by announcing that he had read a Mesopotamian flood story embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh. For Victorian Britain, this was extraordinary. Here was a flood narrative that predated the Bible, preserved only because one Assyrian king had wanted a library. Even today, much of the library remains only partially studied. Tens of thousands of fragments are stored in museums, with many still untranslated. Each fragment has to be matched with others, like a jigsaw puzzle, before the full text can be reconstructed. Advances in imaging and digital databases are helping, but the work is far from finished. Somewhere in those boxes may lie texts we've never seen before, waiting for someone to piece them together. The mystery is not just what remains untranslated, but what Ashurbanipal preserved. Did his scribes copy even older traditions, drawing from texts already ancient in their time? The Samrian flood myths and creation stories found in his library suggest that he gathered materials going back more than a millennium. By the 7th century BC, some of those traditions may already have been fading. Without his project, they might have disappeared entirely. There are intriguing tidbits in the king's own inscriptions. Ashurbanipal claimed that he personally read the tablets. Unlike most kings who relied solely on scribes, whether that's entirely true or not, it was part of the image he projected, a ruler as both warrior and scholar. The bilingual tablets suggest that his scribes were not just copying, but actively teaching, ensuring the preservation of knowledge across languages. It's even possible that some of the texts were imported from distant parts of the empire, making the library a pan-Mesopotamian collection rather than just an Assyrian archive. The visual impression of the library today is less dramatic than Alexandria's would have been. Instead of scrolls and shelves, think of rooms stacked with tablets, many broken, each covered in wedge-shaped marks. For a modern comparison, imagine a library where every book is written in code, many reduced to fragments. It's no wonder that scholars compare the task of translation to piecing together the Rosetta Stone. Except here, there are tens of thousands of Rosettas, many still waiting, and so the cliffhanger remains. What secrets still sit unread in those boxes of clay? Could they rewrite the story of Mesopotamia, or even reveal details about Sumerian science, myth, and history that we've only guessed at? Every fragment holds the possibility of a discovery as transformative as Gilgamesh. Ashurbanipal's shelves of clay tablets remind us how knowledge can survive for millennia if the medium is right. But not all mysteries are about survival. Some are about things that were never really there to begin with, yet lived on in human imagination for centuries. One of the strangest examples comes from the Atlantic Ocean, where sailors and mapmakers swore there was an island west of Ireland. It appeared on charts, inspired expeditions, and crept into folklore. The island had a name, High Brazil. The first known appearance of High Brazil on a map comes from 1325, when the Genoese cartographer Angelino dell'Orto drew it in the Atlantic. Over the following centuries, it kept reappearing in different atlases, sometimes as a neat round shape, sometimes split into two halves with a channel down the middle. By the 1500s and 1600s, it was a familiar feature of European maps, always positioned somewhere west of Ireland, usually at a fairly consistent latitude. Segrophers copied one another, so once High Brazil entered the tradition, it became a recurring fixture. But this wasn't just a cartographic quirk. Sailors claimed to have seen it. Irish legends described it as a land shrouded in mist, visible only once every 7 years. Some stories said it was a paradise of riches and advanced people. Others claimed it was inhabited by wise priests or even supernatural beings. The very name Brazil doesn't refer to the modern country, but comes from the old Irish word, bras, meaning great or mighty. It became entangled with mythology, half real and half magical. Explorers took the legend seriously. In the 1480s, Bristol sailors are said to have launched expeditions to locate the island. John Catt, the Venetian explorer who later sailed under the English flag, may have heard of High Brazil when he visited Bristol before his voyage to Newfoundland. The idea that there was land out there fed into the growing European belief that the Atlantic held unknown territories. One of the most detailed accounts came from 1674. A sea captain named John Nisbet reported that his crew had landed on High Brazil. According to the story, they saw large black rabbits and met a mysterious figure who gave them silver. The tale circulated widely, adding weight to the belief that the island wasn't just a mirage, but a place of wonder. Other reports trickled in over the years, with sailors claiming glimpses of a hazy shoreline before it vanished again behind clouds. So why did High Brazil persist on maps until the 19th century? One explanation is optical illusion. The phenomenon known as a fata morgana can create mirages at sea, projecting distant coastlines into the sky and making them appear as floating islands. From the west coast of Ireland, under the right conditions, refractions could have distorted the distant view of real land, such as parts of Newfoundland or the Hebrides, creating the impression of a phantom isle. Another possibility is simple error. Early maps were compiled from sailors' reports, and once a location appeared, later seagraphers tended to copy it without question. Over generations, High Brazil gained a kind of cartographic inertia. It was there because it had always been there. There's also the more speculative idea that perhaps there really was a small island or shore that disappeared. Volcanic activity in the Atlantic is not unknown, and entire land masses have risen or sunk. The island of Ferdinanda off Sicily appeared in 1831 after an eruption and later vanished below the waves. Could High Brazil have been something similar? A patch of volcanic rock that briefly existed and then eroded away? There's no geological evidence today, but it remains an intriguing thought. The details add to the charm of the mystery. High Brazil was often drawn as a perfect circle divided by a central channel, an unusual feature in map-making, which suggests that it was imagined as a planned, even symmetrical land. Irish folklore described it as rich in gold and home to an ancient civilization more advanced than those on the mainland. For some storytellers, it was less a physical island and more an echo of paradise, a place of otherworldly knowledge. By the early 1800s, however, improved navigation and mapping of the Atlantic revealed the truth. Ship after ship sailed across the coordinates where High Brazil was supposed to be, and nothing was there. Eventually, seagraphers erased it from their charts, consigning it to the realm of myth. Today, High Brazil lives on as a legend, appearing in folklore collections and sometimes even in modern UFO stories, where the idea of a mysterious island has been reimagined as something stranger. Still, it's fascinating to imagine the psychological role it played. For sailors venturing into the unknown Atlantic, the thought of a hidden island just beyond the horizon was both comforting and tantalizing. It promised discovery, riches, and the sense that the world still held secrets. Even if it was never real, it fueled real voyages and real hopes. So why did sailors keep swearing they saw land in waters that modern satellite views confirm are empty? Was it a mirage, a mistake repeated over centuries, or a lost island swallowed by the sea? Whatever the answer, High Brazil remains one of the best examples of how myth, seagraphy, and exploration can blur together, creating a phantom place that once seemed as real as any other on the map. After centuries of phantom islands sketched onto nautical charts, it's only natural to turn to another example of history blurring into legend. This time, not at sea, but at the very foundations of Rome. We all know the story of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers raised by a she-wolf, one of whom founded the city after killing the other. But once the myth ends and the city of Rome begins, what about its first real kings? For roughly 2 centuries before the Republic, Rome was said to be ruled by monarchs whose names, deeds, and reforms shaped the city. Yet, the original records of those reigns were lost, leaving us with a blend of legend, reconstruction, and perhaps propaganda. The problem begins with the Galax of Rome in 390 BC. According to tradition, when the Gauls stormed the city, they burned archives, temples, and public records. If there had ever been a detailed history of Rome's kings, it perished. Then later, Roman historians like Livy, writing in the 1st century BC, had to reconstruct early history from oral traditions, religious lore, and scattered inscriptions. Greek writers such as Dionysius of Halicarnassus and later biographers like Plutarch added their own interpretations. The result is that our picture of Rome's kings is a product of centuries of retelling polished to serve the Republic's values. The list of kings is consistent across sources. First is Romulus, the founder, credited with creating Rome's early institutions, the Senate, the legions, and the division of the people into tribes. He rules for nearly 40 years before vanishing in a storm, rumored to have been taken up by the gods. After him comes Numa Pompilius, remembered as a lawgiver and religious reformer. He's said to have founded Rome's priesthoods and established rituals that tied the city to the divine. Then there's Tullus Hostilius, the warrior king who expands Rome through conquest, supposedly leveling Alba Longa and absorbing its people. Ancus Marcus follows a more balanced figure, credited with building Rome's first bridge across the Tiber and strengthening its port. The later kings carry even more intrigue. Tarquinius Priscus, the first of the Etruscan kings, brings in wealth and engineering skill. His successor, Servius Tullius, is remembered for major reforms, reorganizing the citizen body for military service and taxation, laying the groundwork for the census system. Finally, Tarquinius, Superbus Tarquin the Proud, rules as a tyrant, overthrown after the outrage of his son's crime against the noble woman Lucretia. Her suicide sparks revolt, and in 509 BC the monarchy is abolished, replaced by the Republic. It's a powerful story, one that ties Rome's political identity to a rejection of kingship forever. The question is, how much of it is true? Some details line up with archaeology. Excavations on the Palatine Hill uncovered the so-called hut of Romulus, a simple structure that matches descriptions of early dwellings. The Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer said to have been begun under the kings, really does date to this period. Walls, temples, and fortifications attributed to them leave a faint architectural footprint. But beyond that, separating fact from invention is tricky. Take Numa Pompilius, for instance. Was he a historical ruler or a figure invented to explain Rome's complex religious calendar? His peaceful reign provides a counterbalance to Romulus's violence, almost as if the pair were designed as opposites. Servius Tullius's reforms are another case. Roman historians describe them in detail, but were they the work of one man or gradual developments later attributed to a single reforming king? And Tarquin the Proud's tyranny ending in revolution reads like a morality tale crafted to justify why Rome would never again accept monarchy. What complicates matters is how useful these stories were to the Republic by portraying its kings as either cultural founders or dangerous tyrants. The Republic could frame itself as the logical, almost inevitable successor. The early annals that might have preserved a messier truth were gone. What survived was narrative history shaped by politics and myth. Archaeology offers a few anchors in this sea of uncertainty. The earliest layers of the form. Roman reveal structures and temples consistent with development in the regal period. Grave goods and pottery. From the 7th century BC show, Rome was already wealthier and more connected than once thought, trading with Etruria and beyond. The engineering feats like drainage works and fortifications suggest organized leadership, whether under kings or councils. But linking these directly to names like Tullus Hostilius or Servius Tullius remains impossible. It's worth noting how Rome's neighbors fit into the picture. The Etruscans to the north had powerful kings and sophisticated urban centers. Their influence is obvious in Rome's art, religion, and architecture. The last, these simply tombs or something more? Ceremonial sites, astronomical markers, symbols of authority. Without texts, the answers are elusive. But the stones themselves endure, scattered across the land, stubborn witnesses to a Bronze Age society that left us little else. Korea's dolmens leave us with thousands of stones, but few words. The Celts of ancient Europe give us the opposite problem. They left dazzling art, intricate metalwork, and sprawling cultural influence, but almost no writing of their own. The Celts once stretched from Ireland to the edges of Anatolia, from the windswept coast of the Atlantic to the plains near modern-day Turkey. At their height, they were not a small, isolated tribe, but a patchwork of societies and chiefdoms spread across much of Europe. And yet, despite their size and longevity, their voices are almost entirely missing from the historical record. The core of the problem lies with the Druids, the intellectual and religious class of Celtic society. According to Roman accounts, the Druids were the keepers of law, myth, astronomy, and philosophy. They presided over rituals, taught students and advised rulers, but they relied on memory, not writing. Classical authors like Julius Caesar remarked that the Druids discouraged writing down sacred knowledge, believing it weakened memory and perhaps made powerful traditions too easy for outsiders to access. Their students were expected to learn verses, genealogies, and laws by heart, sometimes over the course of decades. That devotion to oral tradition means that when Celtic societies were conquered, most of their intellectual heritage vanished with them. The Romans, particularly under leaders like Caesar and later emperors, saw the Druids as a threat to their authority. Sanctuaries were destroyed, rituals were outlawed, and eventually the Druidic class was suppressed out of existence. Without them, and without written texts to preserve their worldview, vast amounts of Celtic knowledge were lost. What survives is fragmentary. We have carvings, especially in the form of inscriptions, often in Agam script. Agam is a writing system developed in early medieval Ireland, consisting of lines and notches carved along the edges of stones. Hundreds of Agam stones survive, but most are simple markers, names, family affiliations, and territorial claims. They tell us little about myths, laws, or philosophy. Imagine judging all of Roman literature if the only surviving Latin texts were tombstones. That's the problem we face with the Celts. Most of what we know about Celtic life and thought comes not from the Celts themselves, but from outsiders. Julius Caesar, in his commentaries on the GIC War, describes Celtic society, but his account is coloured by propaganda and Roman prejudice. Tacitus, writing about Britain, provides glimpses of their resistance to Rome. Greek authors like Strabo and Diodorus Siculus mentioned the Celts too, but again as observers from afar, often stereotyping them as barbarians. It's as if the Celts were always seen through someone else's eyes, never their own. What was lost is staggering to imagine. Celtic myths preserved only later in altered medieval Irish and Welsh manuscripts must once have circulated in oral form across much of Europe. Their laws, which Caesar noted were memorized by Druids, are mostly gone, though fragments survive in later Irish law tracts. Their philosophy, which some Romans admitted showed parallels to Greek thought, disappeared entirely. Even their histories, their genealogies of kings and tribes, vanished with the suppression of oral tradition. A few tidbits stand out. Agam inscriptions, for all their limitations, remain an evocative window into early Celtic literacy. Most are carved on standing stones, often marking territory or commemorating individuals. They date mainly from the 4th to 7th centuries AD, long after the classical Druids were gone. Later Irish manuscripts like the Book of Invasions and the Mabinogion preserve rich mythological tales, but these were written by Christian monks centuries after the fact. They may reflect earlier traditions, but they are filtered through medieval lenses. Were these stories faithful echoes of Druidic lore, or heavily reworked narratives adapted for new audiences? That's a debate scholars still wrestle with. Archaeology gives us another perspective. The Celts were extraordinary artisans. Their metal work, like the Gundestrup cauldron discovered in Denmark, is covered with scenes of gods, warriors, and animals hinting at myths and rituals we can't fully decode. Intricate torques, helmets, and shields show a sophisticated aesthetic sense. Sites like Bira in Gaul and Hill of Terror in Ireland reveal centres of power and ritual, but without texts, their full significance is unclear. These physical remains tell us the cults were anything but primitive, yet they leave us guessing at the stories and ideas that once animated their world. Visualize it. On one side, shelves of Roman and Greek texts, thousands of pages preserved. On the other, the Celtic world, rich in artifacts, beautiful in design, but with barely a written sentence to explain itself. The contrast is stark. Europe's cultural balance might look very different if the Celts had recorded their myths and histories in the same way the Greeks did. Why does this gap matter? Because it leaves an entire worldview erased. We know the Celts shaped European culture for centuries, trading with Greeks and Romans, fighting wars, and building complex societies, but we don't hear them speak in their own voice. Instead, we rely on Roman generals, Greek geographers, and medieval monks. Without their own records, the Celts' intellectual contributions remain tantalizingly out of reach. It leaves us wondering, what philosophies did the Druids teach that so impressed and worried the Romans? What stories were told in sacred groves never written down that later morphed into Irish and Welsh legend? And what might Europe look like today if Celtic texts had survived alongside Roman and Greek ones? The Celts left us art and legend, but not their own words. China's Shang dynasty presents their reverse. It gave us the first written records in East Asia, yet almost all of what must once have existed has disappeared. The Shang ruled from about 1600 to 1046 BC, and their achievements echo through history as the starting point of Chinese writing, ritual, and kingship. But what survives is only fragments, oracle bones, and bronze inscriptions, tiny glimpses of a civilization that surely had far more to say. The Shang left behind the earliest form of Chinese script inscribed on animal bones and turtle shells. These oracle bones, used for divination, record the questions posed to the ancestors and the spirits by Shan kings. Scribes carved the queries into the bone, then applied heat until the bone cracked. The patterns of the cracks were interpreted as answers, and the results were sometimes carved alongside the questions. Thousands of these bones have been recovered, creating a database of early writing. They tell us about royal lineages, harvests, military campaigns, natural disasters, and ritual sacrifices. Bronze inscriptions add another layer. The Shang were master metal workers, producing ritual vessels cast in bronze with intricate designs. Some of these vessels bear short inscriptions, names of rulers, dedications, or ritual phrases. Together with the oracle bones, they show that writing was a living part of Shang culture. But they are not histories, not full texts in the sense of chronicles or treatises. They are fragments, functional inscriptions tied to ritual and divination. So what's missing? The Shang ruled for more than 500 years, a dynasty that, long with complex bureaucracy and elaborate rituals, surely produced more than cracked bones and bronze etchings. Historians suspect there were fuller records, annals of kings, ritual handbooks, perhaps mythologies or genealogies written on bamboo slips or silk. Those perishable materials have not survived the millennia. The Zhou conquest around 146 BC made things worse. Victorious Zhou rulers had little incentive to preserve the legacy of their predecessors. Some texts may have been deliberately suppressed, destroyed, or simply allowed to vanish as the Zhou imposed their own order. The story of how we rediscovered the oracle bones is remarkable in itself. For centuries, villages around Anyong, the last Shan capital, dug up fragments of bone and shell, selling them to apothecaries as dragon bones to be ground into medicine. It was only in the late 19th century that scholars noticed the faint carvings on the bones. What had been treated as ingredients for folk remedies turned out to be the earliest Chinese script, pushing the history of writing in East Asia back by 1,000 years. The content of the oracle bones can be startling. They mention battles with neighboring peoples, records of hunts, even notes about royal toothaches and childbirth. They detail sacrifices of animals and at times humans, showing the extent to which religion and kingship were intertwined. Names of Shan kings match those later preserved in much later Chinese historical texts, like the records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian, written more than 1,000 years later. That correlation gives us confidence that the Shang were not myth, but a real dynasty whose traces endured through oral memory. Yet the gaps remain wide. The bones tell us what kings asked the ancestors, not what they wrote in laws, stories, or philosophies. We don't know what kind of literature the Shan may have had. Later, Chinese classics like the Book of Documents or the Book of Songs may contain fragments or echoes of Shang material, but they were compiled centuries later, often revised under Zhou or later rulers. Distinguishing Shang originals from later interpolations is nearly impossible. There are intriguing tidbits that keep researchers fascinated. Some oracle bones bear the earliest known use of the Chinese calendar with cyclical day names carefully recorded. Others show that the Shang had already developed a stable bureaucracy of scribes capable of producing hundreds of inscriptions. The fact that kings consulted the bones before military campaigns suggests that warfare was constant and that political decisions were bound to ritual practice. Archaeology at Anyong has uncovered vast royal tombs filled with bronzes, jade, and chariots. These show a society of wealth and complexity. If writing was already widespread enough for divination, it's hard to believe that the Shang didn't also use it for administration, record-keeping, or storytelling. Yet, none of those documents survive. Perhaps they were written on bamboo slips which rot quickly in humid climates. Or perhaps Shang scribes reserved writing mainly for ritual, leaving daily administration oral or mnemonic. One anecdote often repeated is how late the academic world realized the significance of dragon bones. In the 1890s, a Chinese scholar suffering from malaria was prescribed ground bone from an apothecary. Examining the fragments before they were powdered, he recognized ancient carvings. That moment set off decades of excavation, eventually revealing the Shang script. It's a reminder of how close these earliest records came to being lost forever. The disappearance of Shang texts also matters for another reason. Later Chinese dynasties often looked back to the Zhou as their cultural ancestors, framing the Shang as predecessors, but not as exemplars. If Shang texts had survived, they might have told a different story of Chinese civilization's foundations. Instead, we are left with an image shaped largely by their conquerors. The Zhou justified their rule with the idea of the mandate of heaven, claiming the Shang had lost divine favor. Without Shang texts to argue otherwise, that narrative dominated Chinese historiography for centuries. Visualize the contrast. In Mesopotamia, we have thousands of cuneiform tablets from the same period covering trade, myth, and daily life. In Egypt, hieroglyphic inscriptions and papyri give us religious texts, literature, and stories. For the Shang, all we have are bones and bronzes, functional inscriptions without fuller narratives. The gap is enormous, so the Shang dynasty left the first written Chinese records but only fragments. The rest, their histories, their literature, their worldview in their own words, is gone. If they kept detailed annals or ritual manuals, they were lost with the fall of the dynasty, destroyed by time, or hidden in materials too fragile to survive. The Shang dynasty left us with oracle bones and bronzes, enough to prove their existence, enough to hint at their worldview, but nowhere near enough to tell us their story in full. When their records disappeared, China's earliest dynasty became a half-season outline, interpreted mostly through what their conquerors and later historians allowed to remain. That theme, a culture's voice being cut off, leaving its story to be told only by outsiders, repeats itself in striking ways elsewhere. One of the best examples comes not from East Asia, but from the deserts of Syria. Palmyra was once a caravan city, so rich it rivaled Rome itself, and so independent-minded that Rome decided it had to be crushed. Today, its ruins stand as a mix of grandeur and absence, monumental stones without the local records that could explain them in the voices of those who lived there. The city grew because of geography. Palmyra sat at the midpoint between the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia, perfectly placed to serve as a hub of the caravan trade. Goods from India and Persia, spices, silk, ivory, gems moved west through Palmyra's merchants, while Roman glassware, wine, and manufactured goods moved east. The city's traders became famous for their reach. Inscriptions found as far away as India record Palmyrene merchants establishing footholds, proving this desert town was connected to the global economy of its day. Walking through Palmyra in the 2nd or 3rd century AD would have been like stepping into a desert mirage. A colonnaded street nearly a kilometer long ran through the center, lined with towering Corinthian columns. Temples rose to gods from multiple traditions. Bellarmine Allot, a Roman-style theatre, hosted performances while Arari towers housed the dead in elaborately decorated tombs. Greek inscriptions sat alongside Palmyine Aramaic, a sign of a bilingual multicultural society that thrived on exchange. But Palmyra's golden age didn't last. Its most famous ruler, Queen Zenobia, came to power in the 3rd century AD. After her husband Odenas was assassinated, Zenobia acted as regent for her young son. She proved more than capable. Zenobia extended Palmyne control across Syria into Anatolia and as far as Egypt. For a brief moment, her empire rivaled Rome itself. Coins minted with her image show a woman who was not afraid to claim authority. Rome, of course, could not allow that challenge to stand. In 272 AD, Emperor Aurelian marched east, defeating Zenobia's forces and besieging Palmyra. She attempted to flee, perhaps to seek Persian aid, but was captured and taken to Rome. Accounts differ on her fate. Some say she was paraded in chains and then lived out her life in comfort. Others that she died in captivity. After a second rebellion, Aurelian returned and ordered Palmyra's destruction. The city never recovered its former wealth. Here's where the gaps become clear. Most of our knowledge about Palmyra's rise and fall comes from Roman sources. They describe Zenobia as ambitious, intelligent, even admirable, but always as a rebel to be defeated. What's missing are the Palmyrene accounts, how the city saw itself, how it justified its independence, what its leaders and citizens believed they were fighting for. If those records survived, they were destroyed when Aurelian leveled the city. Even so, inscriptions and archaeology tell us much. Family tombs list names that mix Greek, Semitic, and Arab traditions. Religious dedications reveal a cosmopolitan pantheon with gods from Rome, Mesopotamia, and local cults worshipped side by side. The architecture itself shows the blend. Roman-style theatres and colonnades built with Near Eastern flourishes. Palmyra's art, especially its cereri reliefs, depicts merchants, nobles, and their families in clothing that combines Persian and Roman fashions, reflecting a society at the crossroads. There are fascinating tidbits that bring the city to life. Zenobia reportedly claimed descent from Cleopatra, positioning herself in a lineage of Eastern queens who challenged Rome. Palmyne inscriptions show councils and local magistrates, suggesting a form of civic governance alongside monarchy. Merchants from the city traveled so far afield that some Palmyne inscriptions have been found in India, testifying to the global reach of this desert hub. The ruins that remain are a testament to this wealth. Before their recent destruction in modern conflicts, travelers could still walk the Great Colonnade, pass beneath the Arch of Triumph, and visit the Temple of Bel, one of the grandest religious structures of the ancient world. Reconstructions contrast the city's glory with the broken stones left behind. Palmyra's end raises a question. Was Rome's destruction of the city simply punishment for rebellion? Or was it a deliberate attempt to erase a culture that had grown too independent? Without Palmyra's own records, we can't know how its citizens understood their defeat, whether they saw it as betrayal, as martyrdom, or simply as survival. And so, Palmyra's story mirrors the Shan in one way. Both dynasties and cities left evidence of power and sophistication, but much of their written legacy is gone, leaving others to speak for them. Palmyra showed us what happens when a powerful city leaves behind towering monuments, but loses its own voice, leaving outsiders to write the story. In the Americas, the Maya faced something different. They left behind a written language and murals filled with imagery, yet much of it remains untraded or hidden. One of the clearest examples of this puzzle can be found in Biz at the site of Lami. Among its many temples is a structure that archaeologists call the Temple of the Jaguar, a building whose walls once spoke in colors and glyphs we still struggle to understand. Lamani itself was unusual among Maya centers. While many cities in the lowlands collapsed or were abandoned around the 9th century AD, Lamani endured for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows continuous occupation for more than 3 millennia, from the earliest pre-classic farmers around 1500 BC through the classic period's height between 250 and 900 AD, and even into the colonial era. The city's name translated from Yucate Maya, means submerged crocodile, a fitting image for its setting along the new river lagoon. Its location made it a hub of river trade where canoes carried cacao, jade, obsidian, salt, and cotton between inland towns and the Caribbean coast. By around 600 AD, when the Temple of the Jaguar was built, Lamina was part of a thriving world of Maya city-states. These were independent centers, sometimes allied, sometimes at war, but connected by shared religion, architecture, and trade. Like Palenque, Calakmul, or Tisal, Lamani had rulers who used monumental architecture to broadcast their power. The Temple of the Jaguar was one of those monuments, and the choice of jaguar imagery was no accident. The jaguar was the most potent symbol in Maya cosmology, associated with royalty, warfare, night, and the underworld. Kings styled themselves with jaguar traits to emphasize their power to cross boundaries between life and death, sun and night, earth and the spiritual realm. The temple's murals once displayed elaborate scenes painted in red, black, and yellow pigments. Time and weather have worn them down, but archaeologists still recognize depictions of rulers, deities, and rituals. One section shows the ball game, a ritual sport played with a rubber ball on stone courts across Mesoamerica. The ball game wasn't just a pastime in Maya mythology, it symbolized the struggle of the hero twins who descended into the underworld, defeated the lords of death, and were reborn. On the walls of the Temple of the Jaguar, the ball game linked rulers and ritual to cosmic cycles. Glyphs accompany the images. Maya writing was one of the most advanced in the pre-Columbian Americas, with a logo-syllabic system that recorded both words and sounds. Inscriptions could record dynastic histories, wars, and religious ceremonies. At the Temple of the Jaguar, some glyphs have been translated. Titles of lords, dates on the Maya calendar, mentions of offerings, but large portions remain undeciphered, partly because of erosion and partly because Maya script is still only about 80% understood. When researchers draw the glyph panels, some signs carry translations while others remain blank. A visual reminder of how much we still don't know. Archaeologists face another challenge. Much of the temple is still buried. Excavating murals is a delicate process. Paint that has survived for centuries underground can fade quickly when exposed to sunlight and humidity. Unless conservation is ready, archaeologists sometimes prefer to leave sections untouched. That means the Temple of the Jaguar still hides murals and inscriptions under layers of soil and plaster, waiting for future excavation. Life in Lamoni around 600 AD was typical of classic Maya cities in some ways and distinctive in others. Farmers grew maize, beans, and squash on surrounding fields. Artisans crafted jade beads, obsidian blades, and painted ceramics. Traders moved goods along the river. Elites presided over rituals in the plazas involving incense burning, music, bloodletting, and processions. The Temple of the Jaguar was both a sacred site and a political statement, its imagery linking the dynasty to gods and myths. Unlike in Greece or Rome, where monumental texts praised rulers and prose, Maya rulers used art, glyphs, and cosmic symbols to legitimize themselves. The temple also fits into a broader pattern of Maya-painted architecture. Murals at Bonampak and Chiapas, dating to the late 8th century AD, show detailed battle scenes, prisoners, and musicians, providing unmatched context for Maya warfare and court life. Murals at San Barro in Guatemala, dating to as early as 100 BC, depict gods, rituals, and the maize cycle. Compared to these, the Temple of the Jaguar belongs to the classic tradition of combining dynastic imagery with cosmological themes. Each of these mural sites is rare because most Maya monuments emphasize stone carving rather than painting. That rarity makes every preserved fragment precious. Excavations at Lamani have revealed its resilience. While other cities declined around the 9th century AD, Lanai adapted. It maintained trade connections, rebuilt temples, and remained inhabited. Spanish missionaries in the 16th century noted the site's importance and built a Christian church directly on top of Maya structures, reusing the sacred core of the city. This continuity is unusual in the Maya world, where many centers were abandoned. It gives the Temple of the Jaguar a timeline that stretches from classic Maya religion into the colonial encounter. The details are fascinating. Bones of jaguars have been found in offerings, suggesting the animal was not just symbolic, but part of ritual deposits. Murals show pigments made from minerals and organic materials, including the famous Maya blue, a blend of indigo and clay that has survived remarkably well at other sites. Glyphs include calendar notations, tying rituals to specific days in the Maya long count, which tracked cycles across centuries. All these details show how much information is still encoded in the temple, waiting for better preservation and more complete decipherment. The Temple of the Jaguar highlights both the achievements of the Maya and the gaps in our knowledge. It shows a literate, artistic, deeply religious culture at work. But it also reminds us that even with writing, much can be lost. Without full translations and excavations, the stories painted on its walls remain partly hidden. Was it commemorating a victory, celebrating a dynasty, telling a myth? We don't yet know. Picture a visualization, a temple wall with glyphs. Some have neat translations like Lord or Offering, while others are left blank. Next to them, artists reconstruct what the murals might have looked like. Jaguars prowling across painted walls, rulers standing in feathered headdresses, the ballgame in motion. It's a blend of certainty and mystery, showing both the knowledge we have and the pieces still missing. So the Temple of the Jaguar stands as a reminder that the past can be both preserved and hidden at once. Much of its story is still beneath the ground, waiting. What untold histories are still painted on walls beneath the jungle soil? The Mayans left us only scraps of their world. Persia, on the other hand, built one of the largest empires in antiquity, stretching from the Iron to the Indus. And we know it must have run on mountains of paperwork. Yet almost all of that documentation is gone. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the mid-6th century BC and expanded by kings like Darius and Xerxes, ruled tens of millions of people across dozens of languages and cultures. They pioneered systems of administration that later empires copied. But if you look for the everyday records that would show us how they managed such a vast machine, you'll find almost nothing. The Persians divided their empire into satrapies, provincial units governed by officials known as satraps. Each satrap oversaw taxation, law, military levies, and local governance reporting back to the king. At its height, the empire had more than 20 satrapies, covering everything from the wealthy cities of Lydia in Asia Minor to the deserts of Bactria in Central Asia. The satrapal system allowed local rulers to retain some autonomy while keeping the empire integrated. To keep satraps honest, the king appointed royal eyes and ears, inspectors who traveled incognito and reported on abuses. It was a sophisticated balance of delegation and oversight, the kind of arrangement that would require a flood of correspondence, reports, and ledgers. We know such records must have existed because fragments survive. The Precipitous fortification tablets and treasury tablets discovered in the 1930s provide a rare window into Persian administration. These clay tablets, written in Elumite and other languages, recorded rations distributed to workers, payments to officials, and supplies for construction projects. They show a bureaucracy that tracked grain, wine, beer, and livestock with meticulous detail. One tablet, for instance, records food rations for a delegation traveling through the empire down to the number of sheep allocated. Another lists wine provided for temple rituals. It's mundane material, but it reveals an empire where the king's officials kept close watch on resources. The royal inscriptions carved into stone are another category of evidence. The most famous is the Behistun inscription commissioned by Darius III around 520 BC, carved high into a cliff in western Iran. It describes how Darius seized the throne, defeated rivals, and restored order. It is less a record of daily life and more a piece of political propaganda. But it's crucial for linguistics like a Rosetta Stone. It presents the same text in Old Persian, Elamite and Babylonian Akkadian, helping modern scholars decipher cuneiform. What's missing is the connective tissue between these fragments. We have no satrapal reports, no letters between governors and the king, no continuous annals of administration. How exactly did Darius know how much tribute Babylon owed, or what crops were thriving in Egypt, or how many horses were needed for his armies? That information had to be collected, recorded, and filed somewhere. It just hasn't survived. Why? Part of the answer lies in the fragility of the materials. While some records were inscribed on durable clay, many may have been written on papyrus or leather, which decayed quickly in most climates. The Greeks and Romans later referred to Persian archives filled with documents, but none of those collections remain. Another factor was destruction. When Alexander the Great invaded Persia in the 300s BC, he sacked cities, burned palaces, and looted treasuries. Greek sources describe archives being torched along with buildings. Even if Alexander's aim wasn't to erase history, fire did the job. There are tantalizing tidbits in what does survive. Some Chrysopylus tablets describe the rations of high-status women who traveled with entourages across the empire, showing that elite women could hold administrative power. Others detail payments to artisans, proving that the empire relied not only on forced labor, but also on skilled, compensated workers. The tablets also demonstrate the multilingual nature of the bureaucracy, with Elamite scribes recording data for Persian kings ruling over Babylonian farmers. The Persian postal system is another legendary feature. Herodotus described it in admiring terms. Mounted couriers riding in relays along the royal road, carrying messages faster than any other system in the ancient world. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents them from completing their appointed course with all speed. He wrote a line later borrowed by the modern US Postal Service. That system must have generated vast amounts of paperwork, reports, sealed letters, orders. Yet not a single courier's dispatch survives. The absence is frustrating but also fascinating. Imagine if we had just a fraction of the satrapal archives. We might know exactly how tribute flowed from India in gold dust, from Egypt in grain, from Babylon in textiles. We could trace the careers of provincial officials, learn how rebellions were detected and suppressed, and understand how the empire balanced cultural diversity with centralized control. Instead, we reconstruct the system from scraps. Visualize a map of the empire. Lydia, Egypt, Babylonia, Bactria, Media, all shaded as satrapies. In each, imagine governors writing letters, clerks tallying accounts, scribes pressing seals. The information flows along the royal road to Pipilus or Susa, where archivists file it for the king. Then imagine that archive going up in flames, leaving only a few tablets baked hard enough to survive. That's the scale of what's missing. Even the surviving fragments give us glimpses of a complex and surprisingly humane system. The tablets mention religious offerings provided for different gods, showing tolerance for local cults. They show women and men both receiving rations, sometimes with their children listed by name. They hint at a world where administration was not faceless, but populated by real people, each recorded in a line of cuneiform. And yet the gaps loom larger than the evidence. Were the secrets of how Persia held the world's largest empire destroyed in Alexander's fires? Or do caches of papyri still lie buried, waiting to be found? Every fragment we have suggests a bureaucracy as sophisticated as any in the ancient world. But the heart of it, the daily records of satraps, remains lost. And that takes us to another piece of missing history. If the Persian Empire's paperwork is gone, what about Troy's? The greatest war story of the ancient world, celebrated in Homer's epics, is almost entirely missing from contemporary records. Did scribes once record the real Trojan War, only for those annals to be lost in the upheavals of the Bronze Age? That is the mystery of the lost chronicles of Troy. We all know the story of Troy. Achilles refusing to fight, Hector meeting his fate beneath the city's walls, and the trick of the wooden horse. These details are etched into Western tradition. But behind the poetry, was there a real war? If so, did anyone ever write it down? Tradition places the Trojan War around 1200 BC in the closing years of the Late Bronze Age. This was a time of complex international networks. The Hittites in Anatolia, the Egyptians along the Nile, the Mycenaeans in Greece, and the trading ports of the Levant all dealt with each other through diplomacy, trade, and conflict. If there was ever an age when a city like Troy could have become the center of a major war, this was it. Our problem is sources. The accounts we know best are Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, composed around the 8th century BC, centuries after the supposed events. They preserve details of warfare, tactics, and culture, but they also weave in gods, myths, and set-piece speeches. They may carry memories of a conflict, but they aren't eyewitness records. The closest we get to contemporary evidence comes from the Hittite archives. Texts from the 13th century BC mention a city called Wusa, which most scholars identify as Troy, and a Western people called the Ayawa, who are likely the Ains of Greek tradition. The Hittites describe disputes, shifting alliances, and military clashes involving Willa. This proves that the region around Troy was contested ground, but nowhere do the Hittites describe a decadal-long Greek siege or name heroes familiar from Homer. If such annals ever existed, they've been lost. Could they have been destroyed during the upheavals of the Bronze Age collapse? It's possible. We know the palaces of Mycenaean Greece once kept records in Linear B crypt, but those archives were baked into fragments by fire and left undeciphered until the 20th century. We know cities like Ugarit in Syria kept libraries of correspondence, many of which survive only because they were charred. If Troy had its own archives, they may have been burned when the city fell or simply rotted away in the centuries that followed. Archaeology has done its part to keep the story alive. The mound at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, identified as Troy, is not a single city but at least 9 major layers of occupation. Heinrich Schlein, the 19th century excavator, believed he had found Priam's Troy when he struck gold treasure, but that layer was far too early. Later archaeologists, especially Wilhelm Derfeld and Carl Blegen, narrowed the candidates. Troy 7, destroyed around 1180 BC, shows evidence of fire, collapsed walls, and arrowheads, a violent end that fits the traditional time frame. More recent work, led by Manfred Kaufmann, uncovered the lower city, proving Troy was far larger and wealthier than earlier scholars imagined, with fortifications and clear evidence of trade. The finds complicate but also enrich the picture. Mycenaean pottery found at Troy shows contact with Greece, while Hittite letters mentioning Wusa confirm the city's role in regional politics. Troy 7's destruction aligns with the collapse of other Bronze Age centers, suggesting the war remembered by Homer may reflect broader turmoil across the Mediterranean. What's missing is a contemporary chronicle. Did Greek scribes record the campaign only for their tablets to vanish when Mayan palaces fell? Did Trojan scribes document the siege only for their records to be consumed in fire? Or was the conflict never written down at all, preserved only in song? Oral tradition was powerful in this period. Bards recited epics across generations, and it may be that the story of Troy survived only through performance until Homer gave it form. There are telling details in how archaeology and tradition overlap. Schliemann's so-called Priam's treasure belonged to a city centuries older than Homer's Troy. Yet his work proved the site was real, not just a myth. Later excavations revealed that Homer's description of a large fortified city on the plain of the Scamander was rooted in reality. But without a lost chronicle, we cannot say whether figures like Agamemnon or Achilles were based on real leaders or purely literary creations. Think of the contrast. On one side, Homer's verses full of duels, divine interventions, and grand speeches. On the other, charred remains and scattered arrowheads at Hisarlik. Between the two lies a gap where a written account might once have existed. If it had survived, it could tell us whether the war was fought for trade, politics, or something else entirely. Was Helen a real figure, a political hostage, or a later embellishment? Did Greek coalitions really unite against Troy? Or is that unity a poetic device added centuries later? What we know for certain is that Troy fell and its memory endured long enough to be woven into epic. The missing piece is the chronicle, a clay tablet, a local archive, or a palace record that could bridge myth and history. If such a chronicle ever existed, it has not yet been found. Without it, we are left with Homer, archaeology, and a handful of Hittite references. And so the Trojan War sits on the boundary between history and legend. A story half revealed, half lost. The lost chronicles of Troy leave us wondering whether entire wars, once written down, could be erased by fire and upheaval. But wars aren't the only stories to disappear. Sometimes whole civilizations fade from view, their memory preserved only in traces across landscapes that look inhospitable today. One of the most striking examples comes not from the Iron, but from Africa, the Sahara. The Sahara we know today is one of the largest deserts on Earth, stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. But 8,000 years ago, it was a very different place. During the early Holocene period, roughly between 9,000 and 3,000 BC, the Sahara experienced what scholars call the Green Sahara. Seasonal monsoons shifted northward, bringing rain across what is now barren desert. Instead of dunes and gravel plains, there were vast savas dotted with lakes and rivers. Hippos swam in freshwater basins, crocodiles basked on the banks, giraffes and antelope grazed the grasslands. Satellite imagery today shows the ghostly outlines of ancient riverbeds and lake basins, reminders of this wetter age. The human presence was just as dramatic. Archaeologists have found rock art across the Sahara that depicts scenes far removed from the desert we see now. Hunters with bows chasing herds of cattle, women dancing, and animals like elephants, aurochs, and even fish. The rock shelters of Tatsili Naja in southern Algeria are especially famous, often called the Lascaux of the Sahara. Thousands of images are painted or engraved on cliffs and caves spanning thousands of years. They show everything from daily life to rituals with a vividness that suggests thriving, organized societies. Stone settlements, burial mounds, and tool scatters also mark the landscape. In Libya's Arcus Mountains, excavations have uncovered remains of early pastoralists who herded cattle and goats. In Niger, stone tumuli mark ancient cemeteries, sometimes containing elaborate grave goods. In Chad, discoveries around Lake Chad show evidence of fishing communities that exploited abundant waters. These finds demonstrate that the Sahara was once populated by complex cultures adapting to their environment with hearing, fishing, and farming. The mystery is what became of them. Around 3000 BC, the climate shifted again. The monsoons retreated southward, rainfall declined, and the Sahara began to dry. Desertification accelerated over centuries, turning savas into dunes. Lakes shrank, then disappeared. The societies that had lived there could not remain. Many migrated eastward toward the Nile Valley, contributing to the growth of early Egyptian civilization. Others may have moved into sub-Saharan Africa, bringing with them knowledge of cattle hearing and new cultural practices. But the Sahara itself emptied, leaving behind rock art and ruins as the only memory of the green Sahara world. There are fascinating details. Under rulers like Samudragupta and Chandragupta II, the Guptas presided over political stability, economic growth, and an efflorescence of culture. Later, chroniclers would look back on this era as one of India's high points, comparing it to Athens under Pericles or the Tang dynasty in China. Mathematics was one of the Gupta period's most enduring contributions. Mathematicians began to formalize the decimal place value system, including the use of zero, not just as a placeholder but as a number in its own right. This was revolutionary, enabling calculations that had baffled earlier traditions. Aryabhata, writing around 499 AD, produced treatises that described the value of pi, the motion of celestial bodies, and even the idea that the Earth rotated on its axis. These works influenced later Islamic scholars and, through them, medieval Europe. Without Aryabhata, much of what we call modern astronomy might have taken far longer to emerge. Art and architecture flourished too. The Ajanta caves in Maharashtra, with their elaborate murals and rock-cut temples, date to this period. Their paintings show courtly scenes, Buddhist stories, and everyday life with remarkable detail, using shading techniques that wouldn't appear in Europe until the Renaissance. Gupta-era sculpture, particularly in Sarnath and Mathura, refined depictions of the Buddha into graceful, meditative forms that set the standard for centuries. Literature blossomed as well. The poet Kalidasa, often considered India's Shakespeare, composed dramas and epics that remain classics of Sanskrit. His play Shakuntala was later translated into European languages and admired by figures like Goethe. Other works of prose and poetry show a society experimenting with narrative, metaphor, and philosophy at a high level. But for all this brilliance, much of the written record is gone. The Guptas surely maintained official chronicles, court histories, and scientific treatises, but these were likely recorded on palm leaf manuscripts or birch bark, both highly perishable in India's climate. Wars and invasions also took their toll. In the 6th century, the empire fragmented under pressure from the Huns and later regional powers. Libraries and monasteries were destroyed in waves of conflict, erasing texts that might have preserved the full intellectual scope of the age. What survives are fragments. Aryabhata's Aryabhatiya endures, but many of his contemporaries' works are lost or preserved only in quotations by later scholars. Kalidasa's plays remain, but the wider literary landscape of the Gupta court is hazy. Later, Islamic chroniclers mention Gupta achievements vaguely without detail. Much of what we know about Gupta administration and society comes not from their own records, but from inscriptions. Coins and foreign visitors like the Chinese pilgrim Faxian, who traveled through India around 400 AD and described a prosperous, orderly land where Buddhism and Hinduism coexisted. The material culture adds more pieces to the puzzle. Gupta coins are masterpieces of numismatic art depicting kings as godlike figures, sometimes performing rituals or riding horses and elephants. These coins suggest that Gupta rulers consciously align themselves with divine authority. Inscriptions carved into stone pillars and temple walls record conquests, land grants, and religious dedications. One famous inscription, the Allahabad Pillar, praises Samudragupta's campaigns in a style that blends poetry and propaganda. But even this is more a boast than a chronicle. The gaps are frustrating. We know the Guptas must have had systems of taxation, administration, and law to govern such a vast realm. But the manuals and records are gone. We know advances in medicine occurred. Indian physicians of this era are credited with surgical techniques and medical texts. Yet most of the original treatises have perished. The historian Rila Tapar once noted that the Gupta age is a golden age known mainly through fragments, and those fragments may distort as much as they reveal. Recent archaeological work continues to refine the picture. Excavations at Gupta-era sites reveal urban planning with carefully laid out streets and drainage systems. Temple remains show the beginnings of the Hindu temple as a permanent stone structure, a form that would dominate South Asian architecture for centuries. Painted pottery, terracotta figurines, and inscriptions fill out everyday details. But without the texts, we see outlines without the full narrative. The contrast is striking. We have Ajanta's murals, but not the artists' names or their workshops' records. We have coins with regal imagery, but not the ledgers of taxation that supported the empire. We have Aryabhata's astronomy, but only hints of what his peers and successors contributed. It's as though we're looking at a stage set where the props survive, but the scripts have burned. Visualization helps here. Imagine displaying Ajanta cave murals beside surviving Gupta coins, and then holding up blank palm leaves where manuscripts should be. The juxtaposition shows the richness of what survives against the emptiness of what's gone. There are also intriguing tidbits. Some Gupta inscriptions show kings being praised as Chakravartin, universal rulers, suggesting a vision of empire that was as ideological as it was political. Gupta temple remains include some of the earliest examples of the Nagara style with its distinctive shikara or spire. Later dynasties preserve the architectural forms but rarely the records of the builders. Even Kalidasa's fame comes with uncertainty. We don't know his precise dates or the patron he served. So the Gupta Empire remains both a high point and a puzzle. India's golden age of science, art, and mathematics is remembered through fragments. Aryabhata's formulas, Kalidasa's verses, Ajanta's paintings, coins that gleam with royal pride. But the official records, the chronicles, the libraries, the manuals of administration and medicine are gone. How much brilliance of India's golden age was lost before it could be carried forward? The Gupta world shows us how a golden age can be remembered through fragments of art and literature, even when its official records are gone. Thousands of miles away, and centuries earlier, another society built an equally remarkable culture. One that left no written history at all, but whose story is told through clay, gold, and earth. Before the Inca along the arid coast of northern Peru, the Moxie civilization flourished between about 100 and 700 AD. They mastered irrigation in deserts, created metalwork and ceramics of astonishing detail, and built monumental pyramids. Then, after centuries of success, they declined and disappeared, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct their lives from what remained. The Moxie were first recognized through their hakas, massive adobe pyramids that rise from the desert valleys. These structures, built from millions of mud bricks, were used for both ceremonial and administrative purposes. In the 20th century, excavations at sites like the Haka del Sol and Haka da Luna near Trujillo revealed murals, tombs and offerings that demonstrated the scale and sophistication of the Moxie world. Unlike the later Inca, who ruled with a centralized empire, the Moches seem to have been organized into regional polities, each led by powerful rulers, but sharing a common culture and art style. One of their greatest achievements lies in their ceramics. Moche pottery wasn't only decorative, it was narrative. They produced stirrup spout vessels and painted jars that depicted scenes of everyday life, farming, fishing, weaving, as well as elaborate rituals, warfare and mythology. These ceramics are so detailed that they function almost like a documentary film of the Moche world. Some vessels even show individuals with recognizable features, suggesting portraits. Others depict rulers seated on platforms receiving tribute or overseeing ceremonies. They are one of the richest visual archives of any pre-Columbian society. Their metalwork was equally advanced. Moche artisans worked with gold, silver, and copper alloys, creating ornaments, jewelry, and regalia that combine technical skill with symbolic meaning. Techniques like gilding and soldering were used centuries before Europeans arrived in the Americas. Objects recovered from tombs show intricate headdresses, nose ornaments, and necklaces, often combining animal motifs with symbols of power. The craftsmanship rivals that of any ancient culture and reflects a society where elite display was central to politics and religion. The Mokche also reshaped their environment. Northern Peru's coast is one of the driest places on Earth. With rainfall almost non-existent, the Mokche built sophisticated irrigation systems, channeling water from rivers into fields that supported maize, beans, squash, and cotton. These systems sustained dense populations and allowed the Mokche to expand across multiple valleys. Archaeologists mapping canals and terraces today are still impressed by their scale. Without irrigation, the Mokche world would have been impossible. Yet by around 700 AD, Mokche society declined. The reasons remain uncertain. Climate data from lake sediments and ice cores suggest a series of powerful El Niño events struck the region in the 6th and 7th centuries. These events bring torrential rains that cause floods and destroy irrigation systems, followed by long droughts. For a society dependent on fragile desert agriculture, such swings would have been catastrophic. Archaeological evidence shows irrigation canals buried under flood deposits in some valleys. Political instability may have compounded the problem. Without a unified empire, the Mokche polities may have turned on each other when resources grew scarce. Some Mokche ceramics depict scenes of warfare and prisoners, suggesting conflict was already common. There is also evidence of internal upheaval. At Jaca de la Luna, murals and offerings hidden in the art. Some figures wear what look like helmets or masks, stylized in ways that don't resemble animals. These have often been misinterpreted in fringe theories as ancient astronauts, but archaeologists see them more likely as ritual costumes or depictions of shamans. Other images show cattle in incredible detail, reflecting the importance of hearing. There are also boats depicted, suggesting rivers and lakes large enough to require watercraft. These are invaluable insights into a world otherwise erased by sand. Scientific studies back up the picture. Pollen cores taken from ancient lake beds show a transition from grasses and trees to desert shrubs and then sand. Fossilized bones of hippos, crocodiles and giraffes have been found deep in the Sahara, confirming that large animals once thrived there. Satellite radar has revealed networks of paleo channels, dry riverbeds hidden under dunes, proving that major rivers once flowed across regions that are now empty. One of the largest ancient lakes, known as Megalake Chad, may have been larger than today's Caspian Sea at its peak. Excavations sometimes bring remarkable surprises. In Niger at Goro, archaeologists uncovered burials dating to between 7,700 and 12,500 BC, preserved in ancient lake sediments. The graves included adults and children, some buried with jewelry made of shells imported from far away. One particularly striking find was a burial of a woman and 2 children holding hands, suggesting deep ritual and social traditions. These burials are direct evidence of thriving communities in what is now one of the most hostile parts of the Sahara. The Sahara's lost cultures may also explain developments elsewhere. As the desert advanced, migrations out of the region likely pushed people into the Nile Valley, where the consolidation of early Egyptian society was underway. Some scholars argue that the expertise in cattle hearing and irrigation visible in early Egypt had roots in Saharan practices. Others suggest that the drying of the Sahara was a major factor in the spread of Afro-Asiatic languages as groups dispersed in multiple directions. Yet for all this evidence, much remains inaccessible. The sheer size of the Sahara, nearly the size of the United States, makes excavation incredibly difficult. Political instability in regions like Libya, Mali, and Chad has further restricted fieldwork. And even when sites are found, preserving fragile rock art is a challenge. Wind, sand, and occasional rains continue to erode paintings that survived thousands of years. The Sahara also hides much beneath its sands. Archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging are beginning to map ancient settlements and river systems without digging. These technologies suggest that what we've uncovered is only a fraction of what lies beneath. Entire forgotten societies may remain undetected, their traces buried under dunes stretching for hundreds of miles. What stands out is the scale of what was lost. Imagine standing in Tatsili surrounded by cliffs painted with scenes of animals and rituals, knowing that the people who made them lived in landscapes utterly different from the desert. You see, imagine the bustling shores of Mega Lake Chad, fishermen casting nets where today there is dust. These aren't isolated mysteries, but evidence of entire civilizations erased by climate change over millennia. So the Sahara we know as barren desert was once green, dotted with lakes, and filled with life. Rock art, stone settlements, and burials show cultures who thrived for thousands of years, only to disappear as the desert advanced. The unanswered question is just how many of these societies existed, and how much of their story is still buried under dunes too vast to excavate. The Sahara's lost rivers and buried settlements remind us that even the harshest deserts once held thriving societies. In another desert, this time in southern Jordan, the evidence of ancient ingenuity is carved directly into the cliffs. Petra is often remembered for its iconic facades, the treasury with its columns and sculptures carved straight from the rock face. But the city's survival wasn't based on its architecture alone. Petra wasn't just carved into cliffs. It was engineered to thrive in one of the driest landscapes in the Middle East. By the 1st century AD, Petra was the capital of the Nabateans, an Arab kingdom that grew wealthy on caravan trade. The Nabateans controlled the crossroads between Arabia, Egypt, and the Levant. Caravans carrying incense, spices, silk, and precious stones passed through Petra, and its rulers grew rich by taxing, protecting, and supplying them. The city became famous not only for its monumental tombs and temples, but also for the luxury it could afford in a desert setting. Travelers recorded shaded gardens, fountains, and even pools, amenities that required an enormous hidden infrastructure. The real marvel of Petra is its water system. The Nabateans engineered a hydrological network that captured every drop of rain and runoff, storing it in cystines, reservoirs, and aqueducts. Channels carved into rock faces directed water along cliff walls, sometimes so subtly that modern visitors can miss them entirely. Covered ceramic pipes ran beneath streets protected from evaporation. Aqueducts spanned valleys to bring water from distant springs. The system allowed Petra not only to survive but to thrive, sustaining tens of thousands of people, irrigating crops and even supporting fountains and baths that advertised wealth to visitors. The sophistication raises questions. How did a relatively small kingdom with no massive empire behind it develop such advanced engineering? Archaeological studies suggest the Nabateans combined local knowledge with techniques borrowed from neighbors like the Romans, but they adapted them cleverly to desert conditions. For example, their channels were often covered to reduce evaporation, and their reservoirs were designed with settling basins to trap silt before the water entered storage tanks. These details show practical understanding of both hydraulics and desert ecology. What makes the system even more impressive is how much of it is still visible today. Many Cystines continue to collect rainwater. Modern archaeologists have mapped channels and pipes that still function after 2,000 years. Drone surveys reveal the outlines of dams, aqueducts, and terraces across the Petra Valley. What at first looks like barren cliffs transforms into a landscape shaped by careful engineering once you know where to look. The city's decline, however, shows the fragility of even the best systems. By the 3rd century AD, trade routes began to shift as maritime trade across the Red Sea grew more important than caravan routes across Arabia. Petra's economic foundation weakened. Earthquakes in the 4th and 6th centuries damaged buildings and aqueducts, and without steady income, repairs were harder to fund. By the Islamic period, Petra was reduced to a smaller village, its monumental facades gradually falling into disuse. There are smaller details that add texture to the story. Some of Petra's water channels are less than 20 meters wide, cut neatly into the rock and easily overlooked until sunlight catches them. Archaeologists have found plastered cisterns deep inside the city, their surfaces still bearing waterproof coatings. The sheer number of storage tanks, some estimates suggest hundreds, meant the city could endure months without rainfall. The Nabotans even created redundancy in their system with parallel channels feeding the same areas in case one line was blocked. The blending of architecture and water management is striking. Tombs and temples were often built near channels, combining religious symbolism with practical necessity. Inscriptions found near dams suggest that maintenance of the system was a communal and possibly ritual act. Water was both sacred and political. Whoever controlled it controlled Petra. Reconstructing the system has been challenging. Archaeologists must combine field surveys, drone photography, and excavation to piece together lines of channels that often disappear into cliffs. Some stretches remain unexplored, hidden under landslides or centuries of sediment. Every new survey seems to reveal another system, terrace or dam, expanding our sense of how vast the system really was. The bigger question is how much we still haven't uncovered. If Petra's visible system already shows this level of engineering, what else lies beneath the cliffs hidden in unexcavated areas? Were there sections of aqueducts or reservoirs we've yet to document? Could new technology like LI scanning reveal the full extent of Petra's hydrological map? Petra's water system is a reminder that survival in harsh environments often depends more on ingenuity than on sheer size of population. The Nabateans didn't have the armies of Rome or the bureaucracy of Persia, but they created an oasis of stone and water that dazzled travelers for centuries. Petra's ingenious waterworks show us how much knowledge can be encoded in stone and channel, even when written records are thin. But in India's Gupta Empire, the problem is reversed. An age remembered for its intellectual and artistic brilliance left surprisingly few surviving texts. India's Gupta period, stretching from the 4th to the 6th century AD, is celebrated as a golden age of science, art, and mathematics. It was during these centuries that thinkers first formalized the concept of zero. Astronomers measured the Earth's rotation, poets refined Sanskrit literature, and artists carved and painted masterpieces that still astonish. Yet for all of this achievement, the official records of the Guptas are largely missing. The Gupta dynasty rose to prominence around 320 AD under Chandragupta I, who consolidated territories in northern India and laid the foundations for an empire that would last more than 2 centuries. Suggest ritual responses to disasters, including human sacrifice on a large scale. These sacrifices may have been attempts to appease gods during environmental crisis, but they also hint at a society under strain. The lack of a written record means we rely on material culture to interpret these events. Unlike the Maya who left glyphs or the Andiani who built vast road networks, the Mochi left no inscriptions. Their ceramics, murals, and burials are their texts. Interpreting them requires caution. For example, while some vessels clearly show ritual sacrifice, scholars debate whether these depict actual practices or mythological narratives. Excavations, however, have uncovered human remains that confirm sacrificial rituals did occur, often involving young men who appear to have been war captives. One of the most remarkable discoveries came in 1987 when Peruvian archaeologist Walter Alva excavated the tomb of the Lord of Sipon in the Lambayeque Valley. This intact royal burial was compared to Tutun's tomb for its wealth and preservation. The lord was buried with gold ornaments, elaborate jewelry, warriors, and attendants. His regalia matched depictions on Moxie ceramics, allowing archaeologists to link art with real individuals. Further tombs uncovered at Sipon revealed a ruling lineage, each buried with symbols of power and sacrifice. These finds transformed our understanding of Mokche political structure and ritual. Other sites add more detail. At Dos Cabzas, archaeologists uncovered murals depicting supernatural beings. At San Jose de Moro, tombs of priestesses were discovered, suggesting women held important ritual roles. Their burials included fine vessels, jewelry, and evidence of ceremonial authority. This challenges earlier assumptions that Moche leadership was exclusively male. The art also preserves details of daily life. Vessels depict fishing with nets, farming maize, weaving textiles, and even medical procedures like trepidation where holes were drilled into skulls to treat injuries or illnesses. These scenes provide glimpses of activities that would otherwise be invisible. Some vessels depict sexual acts leading to debates about their purpose, whether they were fertility symbols, ritual depictions, or simply candid reflections of human behavior. The Mokche world was tied to a larger Andean cultural trajectory. They preceded later societies like the Lambayeque, Chimu, and Inca, who inherited and expanded upon Mokche irrigation systems, artistic traditions, and political models. The Chimu, for example, built Chonchan, the largest adobe city in the world in the same valleys once farmed by the Moche. The Inca later absorbed these coastal cultures into their empire, but the memory of the Moche themselves had already faded. Recent research continues to uncover new insights. Advances in archaeology, including isotope analysis of human remains, reveal diets rich in mei and marine protein. DNA studies show connections between coastal populations and highland groups, suggesting trade and intermarriage. Climate studies confirm that extreme El Niño events coincided with key phases of Mokche decline. Still, the unanswered question remains: how did a society with such skill and organization collapse? Was it primarily climate, political fragmentation, invasion from highland cultures, or some combination? Without texts, we can't reconstruct the exact sequence. Instead, we piece together a puzzle from bones, pots, and canals. Picture the contrast: a Mokche vessel painted with a scene of a lord receiving tribute next to a photograph of the arid Peruvian desert today. The pottery is vivid, alive with figures and color, while the landscape is dry and harsh. The gap between them is the mystery. How did a society so advanced in art, metalwork, and irrigation disappear, leaving only fragments of its story in clay and gold? And with that puzzle in mind, our path turns across the Pacific to Korea, where half a world away, another set of treasures has raised similar questions. In Korea, from the 4th to the 7th centuries AD, the rulers of the Silla kingdom were buried with crowns of pure gold, elaborate tree-like constructions that seem to balance somewhere between art, religion, and royal authority. Exquisite as they are, no one knows exactly what they meant. The Silla kingdom was one of Korea's famed three kingdoms alongside Goguryeo and Bayakja. Centered in the southeast of the peninsula with its capital at Gyeongju, Silla began as a relatively small power but grew into a sophisticated state with connections to China, Japan, and the wider Silk Road network. Its elites drew on local traditions and foreign influences, creating a culture both uniquely Korean and cosmopolitan. By the 6th and 7th centuries, Silla was powerful enough to unify much of the peninsula. But even before that, its tombs reflected extraordinary wealth. Excavations in Gyeongju during the 20th century uncovered large burial mounds, some up to 20 meters high, filled with grave goods that spoke of an elite class with access to immense resources. Inside these mounds, archaeologists found gold jewelry, imported glassware, fine ceramics, and most spectacularly, crowns crafted from thin sheets of hammered gold. The crowns are unlike anything else in East Asia. They feature vertical uprights shaped like tree branches, sometimes splitting into antler-like prongs. Strips of gold hang from the sides like streamers or pendants, shimmering as they moved. Some crowns incorporate jade beads known as gokkom-shaped ornaments, thought to symbolize fertility, vitality, or perhaps dragon scales. The delicacy of these crowns is striking. Made of incredibly thin gold, they are far too fragile to have been worn in battle or daily life. Scholars suspect they were ceremonial, worn only for rituals or perhaps placed directly into tombs as symbols of authority. Their form suggests a shamanic or religious dimension. The tree-like uprights may represent the world tree, a concept found across Central and Northeast Asia as a symbol of the axis between heavens, earth, and the underworld. The antler-like shapes echo imagery of animals tied to fertility and hunting. Some scholars argue the crowns embody a fusion of royal and shamanic symbolism, suggesting that Silla kings were not only political rulers, but also ritual leaders. The mystery lies in interpretation. Were the crowns purely regalia marking the power of a king or queen? Were they ritual objects that embodied cosmic ideas used only in ceremonies? Or were they symbols of a belief system now lost to us, combining elements of ancestor worship, shamanism, and state power? Without written records from Silla itself, the meaning is debated. Most of what we know comes from archaeology and later historical sources compiled centuries after these crowns were made. There are fascinating details that flesh out the picture. The gold itself was likely sourced from rivers in Korea, panned and refined by skilled artisans. Hammering gold into sheets as thin as a few millimeters required advanced metallurgy, and the crowns show soldering, granulation, and other techniques that link Sillic craftsmanship to broader Eurasian traditions. Some researchers suggest the designs were influenced by nomadic steppe cultures, where gold crowns and tree motifs were also common. Others point to similarities with Saiyan or Siberian regalia, carried east and south by networks of trade and migration. The gok beads add another layer of intrigue, found not only in crowns but also in necklaces and earrings. These jade ornaments were shaped like commas or curved talons. Their exact meaning is unclear, but they appear consistently in elite burials, suggesting symbolic importance. Jade itself was often imported, indicating long-distance exchange networks that reached into China and perhaps beyond. High-resolution studies of the crowns reveal details invisible at first glance, tiny punched patterns, filigree work, and solid attachments that show extraordinary precision. Visualizing them today with modern photography or museum displays allows us to see the craftsmanship in a way their makers may have intended. Dazzling, intricate, and filled with symbolic weight. The crowns also tell us something about Silla society. Their presence in tombs suggests a hierarchical structure where elites were buried with markers of their authority. But some crowns have been found in female burials, raising questions about the role of women in Silla politics and ritual. Did queens or priestesses wear crowns as well? Were women granted equal ritual authority? The evidence suggests that power in Silla may have been more diverse than we assume. Later, historical sources like the Samukkagi compiled in the 12th century described Silla kings and their ceremonies, but by then Buddhism had become dominant and earlier shamanic traditions had faded. The crowns may preserve a snapshot of that earlier belief system, one where rulers embodied both worldly power and spiritual mediation. What makes the crowns so compelling is how much they stand apart from contemporaneous cultures. While Chinese and Japanese regalia of the time emphasize different forms, imperial seals, swords, or mirrors, the Sillic crowns are unique in their auroral and antler motifs. They seem to belong to a cosmology that doesn't survive in written texts. Modern discoveries continue to refine our understanding. Excavations in Gyeongju's Daringwon tomb complex, including the famous Kaon Machong or Heavenly Horse tomb, have uncovered new artifacts that add context to the crowns. Imported glass from the Roman world, Persian silverware, and Central Asian horse gear all show how connected Silla elites were to the wider Silk Road. The crowns in this sense were part of a global tapestry of elite display, even if their symbolism was locally unique. So we are left with objects of dazzling beauty but little certainty about their meaning. Were they meant to dazzle subjects in processions, to connect kings and queens to a cosmic order, to embody shamanic traditions passed down through generations? Or were they all of these at once? The answers remain speculative, grounded in archaeology, but lacking the textual evidence that could explain them fully. Close-up views of the crowns displayed today in museums, like the National Museum of Korea, highlight the combination of gold, jade, and delicate construction. Imagine an overlay diagrams pointing to the uprights labeled as World Tree, the gok beads labeled Fertility, and the streamers interpreted as sunlight or divine energy. The visual analysis underscores the richness of the symbolism, even if the exact meaning is uncertain. The Siligold crowns remind us that even in a culture that left monumental tombs, art, and connections across continents, the belief systems at their core can remain obscure. Were these crowns mere ornaments or symbols of a worldview where rulers stood as shamans as well as sovereigns? The story of lost records is often one of fire, conquest, or the decay of fragile materials. But in the case of the Ming Admiral Yung Ha, the loss was deliberate. Yung Ha commanded the largest fleet the world had ever seen, sent on missions that stretched from Southeast Asia to the east coast of Africa. And then within a century of his death, much of his official record was erased. His treasure ships and grand expeditions once celebrated were reduced to fragments, leaving historians to puzzle over what the Ming court wanted forgotten and what may have been quietly suppressed. Zheng He's career began at the height of the Ming dynasty. Born Mahi in Yunnan around 1371, he was captured as a child during the Ming conquest of the region and castrated, serving as a eunuch in the imperial household. He rose to prominence under the Yong Emperor, a ruler eager to expand China's influence. By 1405, Zhang was appointed to command an extraordinary fleet on the first of what would be 7 state-sponsored voyages between 1405 and 1433. The scale was unprecedented. Contemporary sources describe 320 ships leaving China's ports, some of them treasure ships estimated at nearly 400 ft long, more than 4 times the length of Columbus's Santa Maria, which would not sail for another century. Even if we take the most conservative estimates, the vessels were enormous, multi-decked, and capable of carrying thousands of crew and vast cargoes of silk, porcelain, and other goods. The fleet may have included 27,000 men on its first voyage: sailors, soldiers, interpreters, doctors, and officials. Over the course of 7 expeditions, Yung Ha led his fleet across the South China Sea, through the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, and as far west as the Swahili coast of Africa. Stops included Champa in present-day Vietnam, Java, Sumatra, Mala, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, Calicut and Cochin in India, Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, and Mogadishu and Melindi in East Africa. The voyages were not about conquest, but diplomacy and trade. Zheng's fleet carried lavish gifts for foreign rulers and brought back exotic goods: giraffes and zebras from Africa, spices from Southeast Asia, and pearls and gemstones from the Indian Ocean. The achievements were remarkable. Zheng He brokered alliances, collected tribute, and established Ming prestige across half the known world. In Calicut, the fleet set up a permanent base of operations. In Sri Lanka, inscriptions carved by Yung Hu himself survive in trilingual form: Chinese, Tamil, and Persian, recording offerings made to local deities. These voyages tied China into a vast web of Indian Ocean trade and reinforced the idea that the Ming dynasty was the dominant power of its age. Yet for all their grandeur, many details are missing. After Yung Hate's death in 1433, political winds shifted. The Ming court turned inward. Subsequent emperors saw little reason to continue the costly expeditions, which they deemed extravagant. China faced threats from nomadic groups on its northern borders, and resources were redirected to defense and domestic stability. By the mid-15th century, construction of the Great Wall was renewed with vigor, while the massive shipyards at Nanjing fell silent. What makes this story striking is that the erasure appears intentional. Records of Yung Ha's voyages, the logs, the detailed maps, the list of contacts and goods were systematically destroyed or neglected. Official histories minimized his achievements. The Ming Shilu, or veritable records of the Ming, mention the voyages but provide only brief accounts. Some scholars argue that the voyages were suppressed to discourage future emperors from reviving costly overseas ventures that conflicted with a Confucian ideal of agrarian stability and self-sufficiency. In effect, China's rulers chose to forget. The fragments that remain are tantalizing. Stone inscriptions survive in Sri Lanka, recording Junki's presence. In Calicut, accounts from local rulers mention his fleet. Some maps attributed to the Ming era, like the controversial Mun show detailed knowledge of Indian Ocean ports. But the daily records, the ship logs, the cargo lists, the diplomatic correspondence are gone. Without them, we can only sketch the broad outlines of what must have been extraordinary encounters between China and the wider world. There are fascinating tidbits. The treasure ships, if their reported size is accurate, were not equaled until the 20th century, when steel replaced wood as the dominant shipbuilding material. Some carried freshwater tanks, gardens for growing vegetables, and compartments for transporting animals. Accounts described the fleet returning with giraffes, which the Mingur marveled at as Qilin mythical creatures symbolizing good fortune. The scale of the voyages dwarfed contemporary expeditions in Europe. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he commanded 3 small ships and fewer than 100 men, a fraction of Yung He's resources. Myths have grown around the missing records. Some claim Zhang He reached the Americas decades before Columbus, citing the controversial 1421 map promoted in the early 2000s. While most scholars dismiss this as speculative, the lack of complete records means the debate never fully dies. What is clear is that Yung Ho reached East Africa, and some evidence suggests his fleet may have gone even further, perhaps exploring islands deep into the Indian Ocean. Without the lost documents, the full range of his voyages remains uncertain. The reasons for the eraser point to Ming politics. Confucian officials distrusted eunuchs like Yung Hu, whose influence under the Yong Emperor they resented. By suppressing records of his voyages, later bureaucrats could diminish his legacy and restore the ideological focus on China's agrarian heartland. There was also a practical motive. Overseas expeditions drained resources and opened China to foreign entanglements that conservative officials preferred to avoid. Forgetting Yang, who was a way of reinforcing a vision of China as self-contained, strong behind its walls, uninterested in maritime adventure. Visualization brings the contrast home. Imagine Columbus's Santa Maria beside a Ming treasure ship, the European vessel barely reaching the height of the other ship's deck. Then imagine a map of the Indian Ocean, dotted with ports where Yung He's fleet left gifts, carved inscriptions, and diplomatic ties. Now picture a bonfire in a Ming archive with detailed logs and charts fed into the flames. The irony is that even without records, Yung He's legacy endured in fragments across Asia. Oral traditions in Malaya, Sri Lanka, and East Africa remember the visits of a great Chinese fleet. Archaeological finds of Chinese ceramics across the Indian Ocean testify to the Ming presence. And yet, in China itself, his story faded until modern historians began piecing it back together from surviving references. So the question remains, what discoveries did Yung Hu make that were considered so threatening, later rulers erased them from history? Were there maps of lands beyond Africa, records of scientific exchanges or unfamiliar cultures, lists of tribute and gifts that undermine the narrative of a self-sufficient China? Without the missing documents, we can only speculate. And with Jung's missing records, our journey turns again. This time it takes us not to the decks of treasure ships, but into the libraries of missionaries. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Jesuits in China recorded everything they saw in encyclopedic detail. Politics, science, customs, and yet much of their work was confiscated or hidden away. The lost records of the Jesuit China mission are another case where history was written down in detail only to slip out of reach. For nearly 200 years, Jesuit missionaries in China recorded everything they saw: science, religion, politics, customs, and much of it has disappeared. The Jesuit mission to China began in 1582 when Matteo Ricci, an Italian priest arrived in Macau. Unlike earlier missionaries who tried to convert through preaching alone, Ricci and his companions adopted a strategy of cultural exchange. They learned Chinese, wore the robes of Confucian scholars, and presented European science as a way to gain entry into Chinese elite circles. Their gifts included clocks, prisms, mathematical instruments, and most famously, world maps. Ricci's 16,002 map of the world placed China at the center, a symbolic gesture that won favor at court while simultaneously reshaping European geographic knowledge. The Jesuits quickly became known as cultural brokers. They introduced Western astronomy, calligraphy, hydraulics, and calendar reform, while in turn translating Confucian classics into Latin for European readers. They documented Chinese rituals, philosophy, and daily life in letters that circulated across Europe, sparking fascination with what many saw as a sophisticated ancient civilization. The Jesuits wrote encyclopedic works in both Chinese and Latin, trying to bridge cultures. 1700 BC, most of the sites were abandoned. Environmental changes may have played a role. Shifts in river channels could have dried up irrigation sources in the Murghab Delta. Some evidence suggests incursions from steppe peoples whose mobile lifestyles may have disrupted settled societies. Another possibility is integration. The Oxys people may have merged into neighboring cultures, leaving their fortresses behind but carrying traditions that influenced later Indo-Iranian religions and societies. Modern research continues to shed light. Excavations at sites like Tulok and Dashli have added more details of BAC architecture and ritual. Isotope analysis of human remains shows varied diets, suggesting social stratification and possible long-distance migration. Genetic studies hint at connections between BAC populations and both steppe nomads and South Asian groups, reinforcing the idea of Central Asia as a crossroads. Still, the big questions remain unanswered. Who were the rulers of these fortress cities? What language did they speak? Did they contribute directly to Zoroastrian traditions? Or did their fire altars represent a parallel but independent belief system? And how much of their history was lost simply because they left no writing? History isn't just the story of what we've uncovered. It's also a patchwork of gaps, erasures, and mysteries that remind us how much remains out of reach. Across this journey, we've looked at everything from the earliest scratches of protoiding to the blank centuries in our records. From civilizations that built vast cities only to disappear into jungle or desert, to entire libraries of knowledge that were burned or deliberately erased. Some tales are clear, others are half-remembered, and many more are missing altogether.
And maybe that's what makes history so captivating.
Not just what we found, but the countless possibilities still hidden in the ruins, the archives, and the landscapes waiting to be explored. So now it's your turn. Which missing history fascinates you the most? Drop your theories in the comments, and I'll be replying to my favorite ones. Make sure to check out our channel for more videos exploring our lost past. And as always, until next time, stay curious. The records they produced were immense. Jesuit letters describe audiences with Ming and later Qing emperors, noting the rituals of the Forbidden City and the bureaucracy of the imperial court. They observed everything from how tea was prepared to how examinations were administered. Their reports on Chinese law, family structure, and philosophy influenced Enlightenment thinkers like Linitz. Voltaire and Montesquieu Jesuit maps blended Chinese and European seagraphy, creating hybrid visions of the world that informed both sides. Yet much of this documentation is missing. When the Kongi Emperor first tolerated, then patronized the Jesuits in the late 1600s, the mission flourished. But by the early 18th century, the so-called Chinese rites controversy, a dispute over whether Confucian ancestor worship could be considered compatible with Christianity, led to papal bans and imperial crackdowns. The Qing state eventually outlawed Christian practice, confiscating manuscripts and expelling many missionaries. Some documents were burned outright. Others were shipped to Europe, where they disappeared into archives untranslated or forgotten. This means that while we have some famous works such as Raichi's diaries and the massive Confucius Cinerum Philosophus, Confucius, philosopher of the Chinese, printed in 1687, countless other letters, treatises, and translations are inaccessible. Some may still sit in the Vatican Library or Jesuit collections in Portugal, Spain and France, uncatalogued or unread. The scale of what is missing is impossible to calculate. There are fascinating fragments that survived. Jesuit astronomers at the Beijing Observatory left detailed records of eclipse observations and planetary movements. Letters from figures like Ferdinand. Fabius described building fountains and casting cannons for the Kangxi Emperor. Maps commissioned by Jesuits integrated Chinese knowledge of Central Asia with European measurements, changing how the West understood Asia's geography. These maps often place China literally at the center of the world, a reversal of earlier Euro-centric traditions. Some of the letters offer rare outsider perspectives on life inside the Forbidden City. Jesuits noted the rhythms of court life, the emperor's processions, banquets, and rituals of obeisance. They recorded details of clothing, etiquette, and architecture that Chinese chroniclers often took for granted. They also described common life outside the palace, bustling markets, harvest festivals, marriage customs, giving Europe a textured view of Chinese society that challenged stereotypes. The influence of these records in Europe was enormous. Philosophers and scientists cited them as evidence that China was a model of rational governance, secular morality, and scientific curiosity. Voltaire praised Confucian ethics as superior to Europe's religious quarrels. Linitz argued that Europe and China were two poles of human wisdom, destined to learn from one another. Jesuit reports fueled the Enlightenment's image of China, even as the records themselves were selectively edited and sometimes censored. The gaps, however, are striking. We know Jesuits wrote dictionaries of Chinese dialects, medical treatises comparing European and Chinese medicine, and detailed descriptions of provinces. Many of these are missing or survive only in partial references. What happened to the volumes confiscated during the Qing bans?
How many manuscripts were destroyed?
And how many languish unread in archives? The absence leaves historians struggling to reconstruct the full extent of the mission. There are intriguing tidbits that highlight both what survived and what didn't. Ricci's 16,002 map survives in only a handful of copies, treasured in collections today. Jesuit calendars, once central to Ming and Qing astronomy, were largely discarded after the missionaries fell out of favor. Letters from missionaries in provincial towns hint at records of local customs that were never published. Some later accounts mention warehouses of confiscated manuscripts, their fate unknown. Visualization makes the contrast vivid. Picture a European world map before Ricci with China as a distant edge. Then his 16,002 map with China firmly in the middle. Next, imagine rows of manuscripts in the Forbidden City seized and carted away, their contents unrecorded. Or picture a European salon where Voltaire reads from a Jesuit letter describing Chinese meritocratic exams, using it as a critique of aristocratic privilege. The surviving texts shaped global history. But what about those that never made it out of China or never made it into print? The mystery is how much of China's story, filtered through Jesuit eyes, still sits hidden. Did Jesuits record events or customs that no Chinese chronicler wrote down? Did they preserve dialects or rituals now extinct? Did they note observations of court politics that could reshape our understanding of Ming and Qing governance? Without access to the missing records, these questions remain open. For nearly 200 years, Jesuits in China recorded in extraordinary detail a society at its peak of global power, then saw much of that work suppressed or scattered. The fragments that remain influenced Enlightenment Europe and changed how the West thought about China. But the missing manuscripts suggest there is still much to uncover. The Jesuits' missing records remind us how easy it is for centuries of meticulous documentation to slip into obscurity. But sometimes history isn't erased in libraries or court archives. Sometimes it's swallowed whole by the land itself. For centuries, the Amazon was dismissed as a green desert, a vast rainforest too poor in soil to support large-scale societies. Early reports of cities and organized civilizations along the Great River were ridiculed as fantasy. And yet, modern science and archaeology are proving those early witnesses might have been new. Evidence shows that the Amazon was once home to millions of people living in complex urban networks that re-engineered the forest itself. The first tantalizing hint came from the 16th century. In 1542, the Spanish explorer Francisco de Orellana became the first European to navigate the length of the Amazon River. His reports describe densely populated settlements, connected villages and organized societies living along the riverbanks. He claimed to have seen great towns, markets, and fields. His descriptions shocked readers back in Europe. How could such an environment, hot, humid, and seemingly inhospitable, support so many people? But Orellana's account was quickly dismissed. Later expeditions found no such cities, and scholars concluded he had exaggerated or simply fabricated the story to boost his reputation. For centuries, his account was treated as little more than tall tales. The dismissal seemed to make sense. The Amazon soil is famously poor in nutrients. Conventional wisdom held that it could not sustain large populations dependent on agriculture. Anthropologists argued that indigenous communities must always have been small, scattered, and semi-nomadic. The myth of the Green Desert, an ecosystem lush in biodiversity but hostile to complex societies, dominated academic thinking well into the 20th century. That narrative began to crack with the discovery of terrapur, or black earth, a man-made soil found in patches across the Amazon. Unlike the natural leached soils of the region, terra prada is rich in nutrients, dark and capable of sustaining crops for centuries. Analysis showed it was deliberately created by mixing charcoal, organic waste, and pottery shards into the soil. Indigenous communities had effectively engineered their own farmland, turning poor soils into productive plots. Terra prada isn't found in isolated pockets. It covers vast areas, sometimes hundreds of hectares, suggesting large populations cultivating organized landscapes. Further evidence came from above. Beginning in the late 20th century, deforestation in parts of Brazil exposed mysterious earthworks, ditches, embankments, and geometric shapes carved into the ground. Many are circles, squares, or interconnected patterns, sometimes stretching for hundreds of meters. These geoglyphs were invisible under forest canopy, preserved for centuries. But once cleared, their scale became undeniable. Archaeologists dated many of them to between 1 and 1500 AD, centuries before European contact. They pointed to organized labor, coordinated planning, and a population dense enough to undertake monumental projects. The real breakthrough came with LAR technology. Laser scanning mounted on aircraft that can penetrate forest canopy and map the ground below. In recent years, LAR surveys over the Amazon have revealed grids of roads, plazas and city layouts hidden under dense jungle. In Acre, Brazil, researchers mapped dozens of interconnected settlements with causeways linking them. Some were arranged in geometric precision with central plazas surrounded by residential areas. These were not isolated villages, they were parts of dense urban networks comparable in complexity to city systems elsewhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. The emerging picture is of an Amazon that supported millions of people before European contact. Instead of a single empire as in the Andes with the Inca, the Amazon seems to have been home to regional clusters of societies connected by trade, shared technologies and engineered landscapes. They built not only fields, but also fish farms with channels and ponds designed to trap and breed fish. Orchards of fruit trees were cultivated systematically, blending agriculture with forest management. The rainforest itself may in part be a human creation, a managed landscape shaped over centuries by indigenous planting and pruning. So what happened? Why did later explorers see only scattered groups in small villages? The answer lies in the catastrophe of European contact. Diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles tore through indigenous populations long before most Europeans set foot in the interior. Carried by trade and early coastal contact, epidemics spread faster than explorers themselves. Mortality rates may have reached 80 or 90% in some regions. By the time later expeditions ventured inland, the societies Orellana described were gone, their survivors scattered into smaller groups. The great networks had collapsed, leaving behind only fragments. There are intriguing tidbits that flesh out this picture. Some LAR scans show villages linked by causeways radiating outward like spokes from a wheel, suggesting coordinated political centers. Archaeologists have found remnants of artificial mounds and raised fields and floodplains designed to protect crops from seasonal flooding. Fish weirs and canals show a deep understanding of aquatic ecosystems. The Amazon wasn't just lived in, it was engineered. Visualization makes the change striking. Imagine a LAR scan revealing perfect squares and circles carved into the earth. Then overlay that on today's dense forest. To the naked eye, there is only endless green. But underneath are traces of cities, roads, and engineered fields. Pair that with Orellana's account of bustling towns, and suddenly his fantasies look more like eyewitness testimony. The mystery now isn't whether large Amazonian civilizations existed. Evidence confirms they did, but how much of them remains hidden? Archaeologists believe only a fraction of the region has been surveyed with LAR. Given the Amazon's size, 2.7 million square miles, there may be hundreds of undiscovered city networks still buried beneath the canopy. Every year brings new finds, more geoglyphs, more terrapa, more hints of orchards and farms. The erased history of the Amazon is only beginning to be rewritten. It's worth noting how these discoveries change our understanding of indigenous knowledge. For centuries, colonial accounts dismissed Amazonian peoples as primitive. Now their ancestors are recognized as skilled engineers who reshaped one of the world's most complex ecosystems. The tragedy is that epidemics and conquest erased so much of their memory that modern descendants were left disconnected from much of this past. The story of the Amazon's hidden civilizations reminds us that landscapes we think of as wild or untouched were often engineered by human hands. A similar revelation has transformed how we understand Cambodia's past. Angkor Wat is famous worldwide as a temple, a stone masterpiece rising out of the jungle. But the temple was only the centerpiece of a far greater achievement. Angkor was part of a city powered by one of the largest and most sophisticated water systems ever built in the pre-Oden world. Its network of reservoirs, canals, and embankments was so vast that it supported nearly 1 million people at the height of the Khmer Empire. And yet by the 15th century, this empire collapsed, leaving its capital abandoned and overgrown. The question is, how could a civilization that mastered water let it become the very thing that brought it down? The Khmer Empire rose in the 9th century under Jaivaran II, who declared himself a universal monarch and established a new capital in the Enor region of northwestern Cambodia. Over the centuries that followed, his successors expanded Angkor into one of the largest urban complexes of the medieval world. At its peak, Anor stretched across nearly 400 square kilometers, a sprawl larger than many modern cities. It was sustained not by fertile plains alone, but by engineering that turned the unpredictable monsoon into a reliable resource. The Khmer built gigantic reservoirs known as barays. The East Baray, constructed in the 10th century, measured about 7 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. The later West Baray was even larger, 8 dikes, 2 kilometers, with a capacity of over 50 million cubic meters of water. To put that in perspective, these reservoirs were larger than modern airports and visible from space. Canals connected the barays to rivers and redistributed water across rice fields. Embankments and dikes regulated floods while channels redirected surplus water to storage basins. The result was a system that allowed farmers to grow multiple rice crops per year, feeding a dense urban population and supporting monumental construction. The scale of this achievement cannot be overstated. Medieval Angkor was a metropolis rivaling the largest cities of the world. Its temples, Angkor, Wat, Bion, Tapom, are architectural wonders, but they were made possible by the hydraulic engine that sustained the empire's economy. LIDAR surveys conducted in the 21st century have revealed suburbs and neighborhoods hidden under the forest canopy, showing that Angkor was not just a collection of temples, but a true city with roads, houses, and fields. Archaeologists estimate that nearly 1 million people lived in and around Angkor during its peak, making it one of the most populated places on Earth in its time. But by the 15th century, Angkor's power had crumbled. The city was gradually abandoned and the Khmer court shifted south toward Phnom Penh. What caused the collapse has long been debated. One major factor was climate. Studies of tree rings and lake sediments show that the region experienced decades of alternating droughts and floods during the 14th and 15th centuries. In dry years, canals and reservoirs ran low, unable to irrigate rice fields. In wet years, torrential floods overwhelmed embankments and destroyed infrastructure. Angkor's system, designed for stability, struggled to cope with extremes. There is evidence that the very scale of the water system made it fragile. Over centuries, canals had been expanded, diverted, and patched in increasingly complex ways. Some archaeologists argue that the system became over-engineered, too rigid to adapt to sudden changes. When drought cracked the earth and floods tore through embankments, the repairs may have been beyond the state's capacity, especially as political unrest grew. Instability within the empire likely compounded environmental stress. By the late 13th century, Angkor was facing external threats from neighboring kingdoms such as Ayutthaya in present-day Thailand. Inscriptions and Chinese accounts describe wars, shifting alliances and dynastic rivalries. Maintaining vast berets and temples required centralized authority and resources. Once political control weakened, so too did the ability to sustain the hydraulic system. The collapse of Angkor wasn't a single dramatic fall, but a slow unraveling. Temples remained active into the 15th and 16th centuries, but the city's population dwindled as people moved south to areas less dependent on the fragile water network. The forest reclaimed the suburbs and Angkor became a symbolic rather than political center. When French explorers rediscovered it in the 19th century, they found colossal ruins entangled with roots and vines, the remnants of an empire undone by the very system that had once made it great. Modern archaeology adds fascinating tidbits. LIDAR surveys have mapped suburbs stretching for kilometers, complete with gritted roads and ponds. Some reservoirs were so vast that they rivaled modern dams in capacity, yet their remains are now silent basins overgrown with vegetation. Excavations show evidence of rushed repairs, collapsed canal walls filled with hastily laid stone, suggesting frantic attempts to patch the system during environmental crisis. At a norm, inscriptions reveal that workers were conscripted to maintain waterways, showing how central the system was to both the economy and state control. Visualization drives the point home. Imagine an animation of the monsoon filling the Great Berets, water coursing through canals into green fields, temples glittering on the horizon. And imagine the rains faltering for years, reservoir dropping, crops withering. Suddenly the monsoon returns with fury, floods tearing through dikes, washing away soil. The same system that once fed 1 million people buckles, leaving Angkor exposed to hunger, unrest, and invasion. The story of Angkor's hydraulic collapse is not one of ignorance, but of brilliance pushed to its limits. The Khmer mastered water on a scale few societies ever achieved, but their success bred vulnerability. When the climate shifted and politics fractured, the system that had supported their greatness became the burden that hastened their decline. How could a civilization that mastered water let it become the very thing that destroyed them? While Cambodia's story is written in stone and canals, Arabia's earlier history is much harder to trace. Here, the challenge isn't crumbling infrastructure or jungle overgrowth. It's centuries of neglect and erasure. Before Islam, Arabia was home to powerful kingdoms, monumental temples, and scripts carved across cliffs and valleys. For a long time, this history was overlooked, dismissed as a prelude to the Islamic period.
Only recently have archaeologists begun piecing together the stories of Arabia's forgotten rulers.
And the picture that's emerging is far richer than we once imagined. Arabia between 500 BC and 600 AD wasn't the cultural backwater it was often portrayed as. It was a patchwork of kingdoms and tribes, some small and local, others large enough to play significant roles in global politics. To the north were the Nabotans, whose capital at Petra controlled trade routes from the Red Sea up into the Levant. They carved monumental facades into sandstone cliffs and left behind inscriptions in their distinctive script. To the south, the Himyarite kingdom in modern-day Yemen grew wealthy from maritime links across the Indian Ocean and land-based incense caravans. In northwest Arabia, the Lehaionites ruled from Dan, building fortresses and temples that rival those of their northern neighbors. Each of these powers rose and fell long before the rise of Islam, shaping the peninsula in ways we're only now beginning to understand. Evidence of these societies lies scattered
Across the desert,
thousands of inscriptions in Old South Arabian, Saftitic, Thamudic, and other scripts are carved into cliffs and rock faces across Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Yemen. Some are prayers to local gods, others dedications to kings or markers of territory. Archaeologists working at Alula have uncovered monumental tombs with facades similar to Petra's, reflecting the shared cultural sphere of northwestern Arabia. Temples in Yemen dedicated to deities like Al-Marka and Aftar show that religious traditions were both diverse and elaborate. Fortresses along caravan routes reveal a level of organization and control that belies the stereotype of Arabia as purely tribal. Despite this wealth of material, Arabia's pre-Islamic past remains a mystery in many ways. Part of the reason is that much of its record was ignored or suppressed after the rise of Islam in the 7th century. Early Muslim chroniclers often referred to the period before Muhammad as Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, emphasizing the transformation that Islam brought rather than the complexity of what came before. Temples and inscriptions were left to decay or were actively destroyed as pagan relics. Oral traditions about earlier kings and dynasties faded, and when Islamic historians did write about pre-Islamic Arabia, they tended to focus on genealogies tied to the Prophet's lineage rather than on the independent history of kingdoms like Himyar or Leon. The incense trade underscores Arabia's role in the ancient world. Frankincense and myrrh harvested in the south were highly prized in Roman temples, Jewish rituals, and Christian ceremonies. Caravans carried these goods north through a network of oases and forts, generating immense wealth for kingdoms that controlled the routes. Roman authors complained about how much gold flowed eastward in exchange for Arabian aromatics. Archaeological remains of caravan stations, wells, and storage depots confirm the scale of this trade. It wasn't just incense. Arabia also supplied horses, textiles, and agricultural produce, linking it firmly into the economic systems of Rome, Persia, and India. There are fascinating tidbits that add depth to the picture. Inscriptions at Ta, an oasis town in northern Arabia, mention kings and rulers who interacted with empires to the north. Classical sources note that the Nabatean king Aretas IV controlled territory that stretched from Damascus to the Red Sea. In Yemen, the Himyarites at times allied with the Persians and Ethiopians. Drawing Arabia into the conflicts of the wider Near East, Byzantine writers described Arabian tribes as federati, client allies who fought in Rome's wars. These references, combined with inscriptions in the desert itself, reveal Arabia as a dynamic player in late antiquity, not a forgotten corner. Yet so much of this history remains untranslated or unexamined. Tens of thousands of inscriptions have been catalogued in photographs, but never fully studied, save dittic graffiti, short inscriptions carved by nomads across basalt deserts in Syria, Jordan, and northern Saudi Arabia, number in the tens of thousands, offering glimpses into daily life, prayers, and migrations. But their sheer volume has overwhelmed scholars and many remain unstudied. Some old South Arabian texts mention dynasties and lineages otherwise unknown. Without systematic study, countless stories remain hidden in plain sight on Arabia's cliffs. Visualization helps illustrate this erasure. Picture a desert cliff, face covered in ancient graffiti, prayers to gods long forgotten, records of alliances and battles. Now contrast that with Quranic inscriptions carved centuries later into nearby rocks, the older scripts fading into obscurity as the new faith reshaped the cultural landscape. Or imagine the incense caravans, long lines of camels carrying resin jars northward, guarded by soldiers from Himyarite forts, their routes stretching to Roman Syria. These are images of Arabia that complicate the common picture of desert tribes awaiting revelation. The erasure of pre-Islamic Arabia leaves us with tantalizing gaps. What myths were told in the temples of Al-Makkah? What records of battles and dynasties lay hidden in inscriptions not yet translated? What forgotten kings once negotiated with Rome and Persia, shaping the politics of late antiquity from the Arabian Peninsula? The evidence shows they existed, but their stories were never fully written down or were deliberately left out of later chronicles. So Arabia before Islam was not an empty desert, but a crossroads of kingdoms, cultures, and economies. The challenge is that its record is fragmented, overshadowed by what came after. What forgotten kings and cultures once ruled Arabia before their stories were erased? The forgotten kingdoms of Arabia remind us how entire cultures can be overshadowed by later history. But sometimes the problem isn't erasure by successors. It's that a civilization left no written record in the first place. In Central Asia, beneath the deserts and plains of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and northern Afghanistan, archaeologists in the 1970s uncovered the traces of a Bronze Age culture with monumental fortresses, intricate jewelry, ritual fire altars, and artifacts linking it to trade networks that spanned thousands of miles. Yet it had no writing,
No known name and no remembered history.
Today, it's known only by a modern archaeological label, the Bactria Margana Archaeological Complex, or BMAC. The discovery came during Soviet
Excavations in the early 1970s. Archaeologist
Victor Serrani led digs at sites that had long been little more than mounds of sand. What he and his team uncovered changed the understanding of Central Asia's past. In the Murgab River delta of Turkmenistan, they found Gonarep, a sprawling city with fortified walls, palaces, temples, and burial grounds. Dozens of similar sites soon came to light across Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan, revealing an entire Bronze Age civilization that had gone unrecorded by neighbors like Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. The finds were striking. At Gonarep and other settlements, archaeologists uncovered massive mud brick fortresses with walls several meters thick, towers at intervals, and carefully planned gates. Inside were palatial complexes with multiple courtyards and residential quarters. This wasn't a scattering of villages. It was a highly organized society with urban planning and centralized authority. Artifacts from these sites revealed skilled craftsmanship. Jewelry made of gold, silver, and semi-precious stones was found in burials, often accompanying elite individuals. Beads of lapis lazuli, a stone mined in Afghanistan, appeared alongside carnelian from the Indus Valley and turquoise from Iran, proof of wide-ranging trade connections. Metalwork was advanced with copper and bronze tools, weapons and ornaments showing careful alloying and shaping. Figurines of humans and animals, often in stylized or abstract forms, were distinctive compared to neighboring cultures. Some depict women with exaggerated features, possibly connected to fertility rituals. Perhaps the most intriguing finds were ritual installations. At Gonorep, archaeologists uncovered fire altars, circular or rectangular platforms with traces of ash and burnt offerings. These bear resemblance to later Zoroastrian fire temples, raising questions about whether the Oxys people were early Indo-Iranians or at least influenced by traditions that would later shape Persian religion. Other structures like water channels and basins suggest ceremonial use of water. Together, the altars and basins point to a complex spiritual life centered on fire and purification. And yet, for all this, the Oxys civilization left no written texts. Unlike Mesopotamia's cuneiform or the Indus Valley seals, no system of writing has been found at BMAC sites. This absence leaves archaeologists guessing about the people's language, political organization, and beliefs. Who ruled these fortresses? Were they kings, priestly elites, or tribal confederations? Did they have myths, laws, or literature? Without inscriptions, the answers are lost. The mystery deepens when considering connections to other civilizations. The BMAC was roughly contemporary with the Indus Valley civilization to the south and Mesopotamia to the west. Artifacts suggest contact. Mesopotamian texts mention trade with a region called Marasi or Margana, which may refer to the Oxys world. Indus-style carnelian beads turn up at BAC sites, while BMAC artifacts appear in Iranian plateau settlements. Some scholars suggest the Oxys culture was a middle link in long distance trade stretching from India to Mesopotamia. Others proposed that BMAC people were ancestors of Indo-Iranian groups who later migrated south into Iran and north into the steppes, carrying religious traditions with them. Tidbits from the finds highlight the puzzle. Gold cups decorated with geometric patterns, echo motifs seen later in Persian art. Beads of lapis from Afghanistan show up in tombs as far away as Mesopotamia, suggesting Oxys merchants played a key role in moving goods. BMAC figurines are distinct, squat, stylized, often female, unlike the more naturalistic art of the Indus Valley or Mesopotamia. The architecture of the fortresses with thick defensive walls suggests a society concerned with protection. But from whom did they face nomadic raiders from the steppe or rival city-states? Reconstructing the culture's appearance is challenging, but visualizations help. Imagine Gonorep in its prime, mud brick walls rising above the desert, towers lining the fortifications, smoke rising from ceremonial fires within temple precincts, traders moving in with caravans of lapis and carnelian,
artisans hammering gold into ornaments.
From above, the city looks like a carefully planned rectangle of walls and streets, an oasis of order in the desert. The decline of the Oxys civilization is as mysterious as its origins.
By around